Good morning and welcome to those of you joining us on Zoom. It'll just take a minute for folks to load into the Zoom room and we'll get started momentarily. Good morning and welcome back to WIDA's 2022 Washington International Trade Conference. We hope you enjoyed yesterday's program and we're pleased you can be back with us again today, wherever you are. Reminder that if you have to log off and log back on, just use the same link you used to log on this morning and you can come right back in. As we did yesterday, we like to call out some of those you are in community with at today's event. So welcome, and welcome as well to our sponsors, and thanks to them as well for today. So welcome today to our session to Glenn Kaminsky with the U.S. Department of Commerce, Bennett Harmon with USTR, Evan Geisman with Senator Tom Carper, and Judith Williams with the Government Accountability Office, the GAO. Welcome, Glenn, Bennett, Evan, and Judith, and welcome back to all of you. We have a busy conference agenda this morning and won't be taking our next short break until before our 11 a.m. session. As I mentioned when we closed the proceedings yesterday, our focus on day one of the conference was on global trade and economic issues. Today's focus is more on U.S. trade policy, and we're kicking things off today by looking at the role of trade in strengthening the U.S. economy and American jobs. We have a panel that brings a diverse set of perspectives. Orit Frankel, the CEO of the American Leadership Initiative, Ed Gresser, Vice President and Director for Trade and Global Markets at the Progressive Policy Institute, and a member of WIDA's Board of Directors, Jeff Cusick, Associate Professor at the School of Government and Public Policy at the University of Arizona, and Chad Thompson, Executive Director for Legal Affairs and Trade at General Motors, who is also one of our conference sponsors. Thanks, Chad. And of course, our moderator, my good friend, Sarah Thorne, Senior Director for Global Government Affairs at Walmart, and a member of WIDA's Board of Directors. As a reminder for this panel and all our panels today, if you have questions, please use the Q&A tab and we'll try to get to some of them toward the latter part of today's session. Sarah?
Thanks so much, Ken, and thank you everybody for joining us. I am delighted to moderate this panel today because this is a topic we've been thinking about a lot. How does trade policy strengthen the U.S. economy and contribute to jobs, or does it? I think for the last number of years, we've seen a massive rethink about trade policy. So does trade policy, some of the studies say 1 in 5 jobs are linked through trade, 40 million US American jobs. Other studies say, no, imports, trade deficits destroy jobs. Some people say that's both is true, and therefore we need to rethink what we're doing for workers and what kind of approach we have to support workers through training and through opportunities. And yet others say we're missing the point entirely because the US economy has shifted. We're thinking about manufacturing, and yet the majority of the economy is services, and digital trade should make us think again about how we respond to trade policy and what are the tools of trade to support American competitiveness as we transition to a more digital economy. These are all questions I hope we can discuss today. I hope we can dig in and think about after a time of for me, pretty radical disruption in trade policy. What do we need to do now to regroup, to rethink, and to get to that place where we can say collectively, we have a trade policy that contributes to competitiveness, that strengthens all US jobs, and hopefully is set for the future in the nature and the way the economy is going. Now, I'm glad I don't have to answer all these questions. We have a great panel to do that Ken has introduced you to them. And so I'm not going to introduce them again. We're going to dig right in. We're going to start with our friend, Ed Gresser. And I'm going to give the question to you, Ed. From your perspective, how does trade policy contribute to American jobs and competitiveness, or does it? And then we'll have everybody answer an opening question, and then we'll dig into hopefully a more constructive dialogue. And then don't forget to put your questions in the chat. Thanks. Ed.
All right, thank you so much. Thank you, Ken, and thanks to WIDA for putting on this great show. It's a great event. I'm happy to be part of it. Just as an opening note on this, it's a great time to be thinking about jobs and competitiveness, because the economy is doing quite well. Those are good times to think about long-term questions. We've had 6 million net new jobs since a year ago. We've had 76 million new hires. That's a record for as long as BLS has been keeping hiring and layoff records. And we had a record low number of layoffs last year, 3 million below the last record from 21 to 18 million. Wages are up. So the workers are doing quite well this year. How do you keep that going, and what can trade policy contribute to it? Let me say a couple of things. In order to succeed in trade, you need to export, you need to have an efficient production system, you need to have import policies that encourage high living standards and so on and so forth, and think about jobs in logistics and jobs in design and retailing, as well as jobs in the industrial side. But you do need to think about jobs in the industrial side and incomes on the agricultural side as well. Trade this year, along with the economy, has done quite well. We've had a big jump in exports of about $350 billion. We've had an even bigger jump in imports of about $500 billion. A lot of this is going to be consumer driven and reflecting both stimulus here and abroad and the tentative recovery from COVID. But I think there are a couple of things to think about on both sides. One is, over the past 4 years, we've had an experiment in tariff policy. The 232 and 301 tariffs have about roughly doubled the size of the tariff system, from $40 billion a year to $85 billion a year, and from 1.4% of imports to 3% or so. If you look at this, how this works, it has changed the tariff system in two ways. One is to increase the size of the tariff system overall. The other is to shift it from a permanent system, which is mainly a way to tax retailers and families, into a mix of this with 232 and 301 tariffs, which are mainly tariffs or taxes on manufacturers and construction firms. If you look at the types of things that have come under these tariffs, they're metals. Those are obviously big construction and automaker and machinery products. There are components of high-tech goods like speaker box assemblies, printed circuits, power cords, and so forth. There are capital equipment tariffs and testing and measuring equipment, electroplating and electromechanical machinery, conveyor machines, and so on and so forth. I'm still working through this, but it looks like manufacturers are probably paying 40% of the additional tariffs, construction firms maybe 10 or 15%, families maybe 20%. So this has been a significant new financial hit on the industrial side of the economy, as well as an effort to protect it. And we have to think through how coherent is that and what can be done. I think if we are looking for a more competitive and more resilient industrial sector, we should start with the renewal of the exclusion process for the 301 tariffs, and then think through where are these hitting the industrial side of the economy particularly hard, and how do we work through it? Second side is the export economy. We have, as I mentioned, very strong growth, kind of a jobs boom. At some point, we should be shifting towards a more export-driven and more less stimulus-driven growth pattern, because everyone is debating inflation and what can be done about that. One of the cures to that is exporting. The export share of GDP last year was 10.8%. Setting aside the COVID year, that was the lowest export share of GDP since 2006. So we should be thinking about how can we do a bit more and a bit better. I think the administration has done a lot of good work and probably isn't getting all the credit it should for re-engaging with Europe, with the WTO, trying to work through some of the problems with Japan and the UK left over in the last administration. But we will need, I think, a more ambitious negotiating agenda, thinking about two problems in particular, maybe. One is that with the implementation of the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership Agreement in Asia, a lot of US manufacturers and ag producers will be facing a deteriorating tariff situation where we're more and more at a disadvantage relative to China, to Japan, to Australia, other competitors. We have similar challenges in quite rapidly developing sub-Saharan African economy. Then on the other side, As you mentioned, Sarah, the digital area is really an area we have a tremendous opportunities, both in creating digital industry-related jobs here and in exporting services like healthcare, like education, like entertainment, and the internet is evolving in lots of ways, but one way is towards more and more restrictions and more nationalistic policies. And we should be quite engaged in trying to fend that off and trying to develop consensus on appropriate regulations that will protect consumers, protect people against cyber theft and so forth, but also keep markets open to our legitimate and very high quality products. So that would be my quick answer.
Thanks so much. Fascinating about the tariffs on manufactured goods. Jeff, interested in hearing your perspective, and feel free to respond to Ed's positing about the impact of tariffs on manufacturing and the 301 tariffs as well.
Sure, just on that point, Sarah, and thanks again to everyone for having me. One thing that I think is going to be an important priority moving forward is thinking about trade volatility, not just traditional stories about import penetration. So many of the arguments over free trade are about how if we buy stuff from abroad, we're producing less of it at home, and that crowds out local employment, right? And so rhetoric around the trade deficit is all about this, right? That we're losing jobs and we're consuming so much from other markets in the global economy. But volatility, I think, is especially important. And it's not just a story about COVID. We've seen how the pandemic shocked global markets in a variety of ways. But even before that, 70% of the counties in America with the slowest job growth, or indeed the ones that lost jobs over the last decade since the Great Recession, were all exposed to above average trade volatility. So that could mean two things. One, it could be a traditional import shock, like the China shock we hear so much about, or it could be an export shock, like we see in the US-China trade war, when exporters like our soybean farmers are exposed to retaliatory barriers abroad, then their market access is suddenly cut off. So I would just want to stress that point, add that to the story about imports versus exports, the traditional rhetoric around import penetration and competing with buying stuff from abroad. Because as you've already mentioned, we know that imports support lots of jobs in America. We know that there are a variety of industries that thrive on imports. So the story is not just about how much we're consuming from abroad in terms of levels, but how stable and consistent are those trade relationships around the world over time. And we see increasingly where there's volatility, workers are hurt. And then just to mention a couple of other things briefly by way of getting us started. I think one of the real benefits of the current administration is this growing recognition that a kind of a two-tier approach to these issues is required. So what I mean by that is there's kind of a traditional, kind of outward-looking international trade policy element to this, and then there's growing recognition that we need domestic initiatives that complement our trade policies. So when we're thinking about kind of the rules of the game and what those global policies look like, I think there are some interesting legal challenges ahead of us. So we've seen folks argue for dismantling some of our trade agreements, reforming some of our trade agreements. What are we going to do about the World Trade Organization and its rule set? Well, many of the reform proposals out there for a more worker-centric trade policy, and especially more worker-centric international trade body of law, call for greater flexibility in the rules. The logic is that you allow domestic governments to protect their workers during hard times. That's going to better enable them to comply with the global trade regime generally, and it's going to benefit those domestic firms who are suffering during market shocks or whatever the conditions might be. We kind of get that logic intuitively, but one of the problems with greater flexibility is, of course, that we already know trade remedies use is controversial. Almost a full quarter of all international trade disputes at the WTO are just about anti-dumping specifically. So I think if we're considering what international trade law looks like moving forward, and we want greater flexibility for governments to protect their workers and their local firms, we've got a delicate balance on our hands between how much flexibility do you afford and how much do you open yourself up to the kind of legal morass associated with potential abuse of the system. So that's kind of a story about abroad. And then at home, just very briefly, I would say we hear a lot about America lagging behind, labor shortages in this country, lack of competitiveness. And I think we've got to take seriously some of these proposed investments in domestic infrastructure. And perhaps you would expect me to say what I'm about to say, but I think education also matters. And it took us 10 years after the Great Recession for public education expenditures per student, 10 years to return to pre-Great Recession levels. So we're on the right track now, but that's just my pitch for if we're concerned about global competitiveness, domestic infrastructure projects, education spending, maybe even thinking about expanding things like TAA. We need to complement those global policies with domestic work as well.
Thanks, Jeff. Chad, you're right there. You're a GM as a manufacturer, but also a service company and moving into sort of next generation autos. How would you respond to this big, broad question about jobs and the impact of trade policy?
Yeah, thanks, Sarah. I think part of my job on the panel is to provide a counterpoint to the other panelists, but I actually agree with most of what Ed and Jeff are saying. I mean, I think they make really good points. From a practical manufacturing perspective, trade is incredibly important, and it factors in the decisions we're making every day, both on the input side and the output side. On the input side, when we decide what countries to source what products and raw materials from, when we look at both availability and supply chain resilience and the price that we're paying for those inputs, and all that impacts the competitiveness of our products and the number of people we can employ. On the output side, trade's incredibly important for a number of reasons. One being scale. So, for example, when we look at a new vehicle that we're thinking about bringing to market, we take a look at how many do we think we can sell? How much is it going to cost to do the research and development, to do the engineering, to actually install the production capacity. And if you have just the domestic market, it's harder to justify some of those expenditures. But if you have export opportunities, then the ability to spread those costs out over more vehicles, then it makes the the business case more attractive. And in the same way, once you decide to build a vehicle, we have to determine how many we want to make, where we want to make them, and trade policy is a really important part of that, and that can impact the number of jobs that we have in a plant, the number of shifts that we run, the number of jobs that our suppliers that are in large part located around the plant, how many they employ. And so trade is incredibly important for us and for other manufacturers. And I think one thing that a point that Ed made that is incredibly important is, as we consider where to go from here on trade policy, we need to keep domestic manufacturers in mind and make sure that they're not put at a competitive disadvantage to our foreign counterparts, both here in the domestic market and in export markets.
Thanks so much. Ict, I know you wanted to talk a little bit about transition to digital and how we think about that from a worker-centric perspective. Let's go to you, and then let's try to weave some of these threads together and some additional.
Of course, I'm muted. First, I just thought I'd give a broad response to a couple of the comments that were made. I think there's no question that trade has been beneficial, but I don't think we've really reckoned with the fact that, there have been major dislocations and negative impacts. And I don't think that that's really been adequately reckoned with. And I think it's one of the reasons that politically, you've seen both, certainly we saw in the 2016 election, both Democrats and Republicans running away from trade. So I think it's kind of, we just can't keep talking about it in the same way. I think that there's a pretty broad recognition that Trumpism clearly wasn't the right way. But I think there's also a feeling that the policies in the decades before that weren't the right way. We don't have adequate social supports, and we weren't really taking care of the people left behind. Trade adjustment assistance is inadequate, and we didn't provide enough social supports, and we didn't build into our trade agreements adequate disciplines to deal with China, subsidies and other things like that. So, part of the reason actually that I and a few others started the American Leadership Initiative was the thought that, we need to think about trade in a different way. We just can't keep thinking about it in the same rubric. So I think, from that notion, we go to, what is a worker-centric trade policy? And in my mind, and then I could talk a bit about digital and get more into that in the conversation. But I think it was Jeff who made the comment that I agree with, that the first part of this is that the bright line that we used to have or think about with regard to domestic and international policies no longer exists. We really can't kind of think about it in the same way. And in my mind, a worker-centric trade policy, and certainly a worker-centric digital policy, starts at home. If we look at digital, and the reason I'm focusing at the moment on digital is because, obviously there's just been such a dramatic increase in digital technologies, even for manufacturing, or, for almost everything that we do. And the first step is really to address the digital divide at home, which we have which drives huge economic equality. And a lot of that is also, it's not just, it's also particularly vis-a-vis underserved communities. There's a sharper digital divide for low-income people, for African Americans, for women, for rural Americans, for Native Americans, disabled Americans, Hispanic, you go on the line. So we need to really make sure that there's access for all those underserved communities. We need to update trade adjustment assistance. And we need to, accelerate the ability for small businesses to access global networks. That's something that also we haven't focused on. I think trade policy has really been focused on large companies, and small businesses need a lot of attention so that they can access globally. And really in the US, half of the private sector workforce, 60 million employees last year, worked for small companies. So it's a very significant economic driver.
I think you've gone on mute again.
Oh, I thought it was me.
Oh, have I?
Now I can hear you. Thanks.
Oh, I don't know how long I've been on mute.
Just a few seconds.
Few seconds. Okay, so I just said I could talk about global, what I would want to see in a worker-centric digital agreement, but why don't I take a pause and open up for conversation, and we can come back to some.
So this is great. We've had sort of a broad perspective here, which says, one, we've got to look at volatility and shocks. Two, we need to think about the impacts of policies that seem like they would be addressing state-sponsored actors like tariffs, but what are the ultimate impacts of those? And, third, how do we think about digitization in terms of managing inequality? So I have a couple of sort of provocative follow-up questions that anybody just raise your hand and jump in. One, we talk a lot about the digital agenda, but as Arit, as you suggest, if we pursue sort of a digital trade agreements, does that actually lead to additional inequality? I think one of the big challenges that we've had with trade policy is this sense that it only benefits big companies. And how do we reconcile this idea that that it's, because we're a little bit afraid of market access and manufacturing and the impact, we're just going to focus on a digital agenda. But could that actually lead to more inequality because we've not addressed these fundamental competitiveness issues? That's one question. The second question I have is, if we don't address the people who aren't playing by the rules, is it possible to actually create more rules? Should we be entering into new agreements if in the past the biggest actors haven't actually paid, haven't actually lived up to their obligations? And in fact, some could say that in the US has actually sort of not in the last several years been living up to the spirit of, I would say, the commitments that we've made in terms of multilateralism. So I don't know who wants to jump in on any of those questions. I was thinking Jeff's come off mute, so we'll throw it to you first, and then hopefully you'll be provocative and everybody will want to jump in.
Well, maybe, but yeah, just a quick follow-up on that, especially on this point about inequality, which is a word that I'm glad came up. I mean, one of the things we have to do if we're thinking about digital or any other sector of the economy is think about the kind of jobs we're creating or the quality of those jobs, right? So one of the difficulties in thinking about kind of big picture arguments, is trade good or bad for America, is that there's competing statistics. We can say, the US lost 30% of its manufacturing jobs between the year 2000 through the end of the Great Recession. Or we can say after the Great Recession, there was a full decade of uninterrupted positive jobs reports. And for every manufacturing job we lost, we added 4 jobs in the service sector. Now, all of those things are strictly true, but does it tell us anything about the quality of the jobs we're creating, the quality of the jobs we're losing, and the effect on inequality, as Ora just mentioned, that I think we should take really seriously? So it turns out that the fastest growing segments of the labor force are not Silicon Valley and Wall Street, which we might think would be good news, but it's still leisure and hospitality, it's still retail trade. Those are America's 2 biggest employers, and they're the 2 lowest paid industries on average in non-farm employment. So my point is only to say, yes, inequality is a problem. It's worth taking seriously. I think we all get that. But if we're thinking about job creation, and especially if we're thinking about prioritizing digital, which I do believe makes sense, then we want to keep an eye on, who's enfranchised here, who has access to these jobs or careers, and what does it really mean for the thinness or thickness of individuals' wallets. So I think maybe not so controversial on that, because everybody would presumably agree with at least some portion of that, but just to say, yes, I think inequality is worth keeping in the conversation.
So I just wanted to jump in for a second and address Sarah's question on could a digital trade agreement lead to greater inequality? I mean, I think one thing we've learned a lot is how to frame an agreement so that doesn't happen. And I think we've done a lot of work on what a worker-centric digital agreement would look like. And there's some, also good samples out there. I mean, if you look at DIPA, the digital agreement between Chile, Singapore, and New Zealand, it has in it a module that talks about access and inclusion, and countries commit to closing their digital divides, particularly with underserved communities. It has a module on facilitating trade for small businesses. I would go further in an agreement and talk about a digital agreement. I mean, to your point, one of the big jobs that's come up on the digital, since we've had digital technologies, is gig workers or platform workers. And I think an agreement should have a provision saying that the countries want to work together to create, and it's a global problem, not just a US problem, to create social, talk about how to address gig workers, creating social safety nets. So I think there's a lot of things you can put in an agreement that really can try to address some of these inequalities.
I'm going to jump in. It looks like Sarah had a little issue with her Zoom link. We've seen a couple of those this morning, so apologies on that. Ed, it looks like you were ready to jump in. Did you want to jump in on that thread? And I also wanted to, we also probably follow up a little bit more on some of the tariff and tariff exclusion issues that have come up in recent years.
Let me stick with this theme for a minute. I think all of us who are engaged in trade policy in Washington in various ways, as analysts or in government or in business, want to be confident that what we're doing is important and relevant. And I very much believe that it is, but it isn't the only thing in the world. And we have to be aware that if you're talking about the digital economy, it is growing and expanding very much because companies are deploying more and more fiber optic cable, and manufacturing and agricultural trade grow because the container shipping world and the roll-on roll-off fleet and the maritime and airports get more and more efficient. So it is quite hard to fix a problem that's, even if it were rightly assumed to come from trade growth, strictly through agreements and policy that with other governments. The core issue that I think Jeff and Norita both pointed to is what sort of supports through domestic policy do workers need, do families need? How do you get a consensus for the right approaches to healthcare, to job search and job placement assistance? How much of that comes from the government versus how much from companies and unions? And whatever we're doing through agreements is a complement to those more fundamental domestic policies. If what we're talking about is confidence of a worker in a factory, in a restaurant, in a gas station, wherever, that if I lose my job, I'll have something okay to fall back on and some new options to turn to. And I think that's really the core of it. And trade policy may help, but if we're relying on trade policy to be the main response, I do not think it will pan out.
Chad, it looks like you're ready to jump in.
Yeah, I'll jump in briefly on the digital piece. So backing up to some of the earlier comments on domestic policy, incredibly important. And we think the administration is doing some great things to promote electric vehicle adoption and supply chain and production here. And some of it you may have seen. Last week, we announced a new $7 billion investment in Michigan, much of that to produce batteries and electric vehicles here. And there's a digital piece to that. As vehicles get more and more advanced, there's going to be more software defined. There's going to be reliance on more data, whether it's to map and provide semi-autonomous features for your vehicle, or just to provide entertainment and software in the vehicle. And so one of the things that we hope that a digital agreement would accomplish is allow us to deploy a lot of those same features for the exports that we build in the U.S. and send to other countries. We have a hard enough time now just doing different seatbelt harnesses and mirrors for different countries. If there's a separate software solution or separate data localization requirements for each of the countries we want to sell vehicles, that makes it harder for our U.S. produced stuff to be competitive. So the digital piece, very important.
And we have a question that came in that stays in this theme, asking about the impact of digitization on the economic activities of digital areas. How can our trade policies help enhance access for digital to other underserved communities?
I think the question is regarding developing countries. Digitization in developing countries.
Mm-hmm.
It's interesting because, if you look at groups that work to aid, like sub-Saharan Africa and the poorest places in the world, they will tell you that the single best thing you could give a woman entrepreneur to speed development is a cell phone, a smartphone. If you give, a female, and most of these, small business entrepreneurs in the deep developing world are women, smartphone gives you access to banking, gives you access to the economy, allows you to sell your goods, et cetera, et cetera. So obviously it's more complicated than that. And we need, developing countries have a digital divide just like we do, et cetera. But digitization and the availability of technologies can actually be a big boon to even the poorest countries.
I see Ken stepped in for me, which was great when my computer decided to shut down automatically. So I appreciate, I guess we've moved on to digital, and not to jump around too much, but the one other area I wanted to talk about was TAA and adjustment, and how we were thinking about that, and how do we adjust, and how do, is adjusting after the fact appropriate, or should we be pre-adjusting and be pre-competitive? And I wonder if anybody has thoughts on that. And I think one of the things I've always thought about trade adjustment assistance is if you've already lost your job and then you label it because of trade, does that actually contribute to this sense that trade destroys jobs? And are we actually then training for the jobs of the future? Or how are we thinking about how we link that type of training to where the jobs are going to be, as opposed to where they might have been in the past? Don't know if anybody has thoughts on that.
Well, I just want to chime in with something related to this. Sorry, Sarah, if it's not a direct answer to what you're asking, but there have been a couple of mentions so far about, are existing trade rules good, but they're just weakly enforced, or do we need new trade rules? But I think, as Orit's pointed out correctly, trade law probably lags desperately behind in certain sectors of the economy, including digital. So I would just stress that we do have a real opportunity now to think about what international trade rules look like moving forward, because they're just not there at all in a lot of existing agreements. And so some of these ideas about, what some of the international trade law folks would call socially inclusive trade rules, or a worker-centered trade policy, we have a real opportunity for, I wouldn't even call it reform right now, but rule creation. And so that's a priority that's worth considering. Now, I know, Sarah, you had something more domestic in mind than that, but I just think the international law kind of context for this, it's kind of an open question right now, and that's potentially a good thing.
Yeah, absolutely. Any other thoughts there, Ed?
Yeah, I was going back to your question on TAA. I think there are three things come to mind. One is that most studies at most times find trade-related job loss is relatively minor compared to losses from domestic competition and recessions and so forth. And in circumstances where that remains true, TAA is, I think, it's a quite ambitious program, much more than is available to waitresses or to retail workers who lose jobs. Mark Warner, when he was governor of Virginia, had a great approach in creating kind of single points of contact for textile communities in Southern Virginia, where they were transitioning out of the apparel industry. So we'd have one state office where they had community college, the employment search, health offices, all the services you would have in one place. For someone who wanted to come in, take a year and a half to train as a electrician or something like that. And I think that remains quite a good model. The really challenging one, and I don't know if it's going to come up again, is the research done on China shock, where very large country suddenly becomes very, very competitive. That rewards a lot of people and it punishes a lot of people, irrespective of what the rules are. For a long time, like miners and farmers were doing very well, energy workers were doing really well, mid-tier manufacturing workers were really struggling, and that led to situations where research would find communities that were dependent on 2 or 3 big factories would really go into depressions. And the option in those cases of training you for a new job in that area was not a good one, because ultimately those communities had fewer jobs than they had before, and the solution is a painful one to move to somewhere else where there's more jobs, rather than to stay there for 2 years and train for something that may not ever occur again. So I think that in the TAA world, there's a real distinction between the normal situation where we have some competition and job loss, It's essentially, it's frictional, sometimes localized, but you can deal with it through a program like TAA. And another one where there's a big structural change that TAA was not capable of dealing with, and might even have been in some ways a kind of perverse program.
It's interesting, Ed. It kind of ties back into Jeff's shocks, you know, and the volatility question. So maybe we need kind of a super flexible TAA.
Sarah, I just wanted to add
Yeah.
a couple quick points. I mean, obviously, everyone I know agrees that optimally you'd have adjustment assistance and not trade adjustment assistance. But for a whole variety, that just isn't on the political agenda at this point. But I will say that the new the new TAA proposed by the House does include TAA for communities, which I think really addresses the point that Ed, you know, very correctly identified. So hopefully that will that piece will stay in the new bill.
Yeah.
And maybe one additional thing worth pointing out about TAA is that there's some pretty compelling recent evidence about not just whether the provision of it is insufficient, but how underutilized it actually is. So part of the story might also be about promoting access to existing programs, recognizing, of course, that maybe those solutions are imperfect, but some folks who did research on the frequency with which out-of-work people petition for help shows that it's not that frequent.
Ed has slightly a cheeky Q&A saying, should we have TAA for people who've lost their jobs due to 301 and 201 tariffs, which fair point. There are a couple other questions in the chat, or one that's sort of directed towards you a little bit, which is, you know, if we talk about the importance of equalizing access to ICT infrastructure, what are we doing about creating better opportunities through tariffs, through trade policy, for people to have actually the tools that hopefully work when they're on Zoom calls to be able to access the internet? Thoughts on that? All right, you're on mute.
Yeah. Famous last words. I do think, I mean, you know, we don't have a lot, there aren't a lot of tariffs on ICT products at this point. I mean, we have the ITA, which really eliminated products on those pieces of equipment. I do think, you know, we need to ensure closing the digital divide, not just domestically, but globally. And I think, you know, when we look at negotiating agreements, I think that's something that we have to take into consideration and can take into consideration across the board.
Yeah. Ed, I see you're off mute. Did you have
raise one minor point of disagreement on that last one. We have, I feel right now, quite a lot of tariffs on ICT goods. That is a significant target of the 301. So we don't have
correct. Yeah, sorry, that was my, yes, you're right. We didn't have tariffs and then they were put on, right?
So Ed, just to go on, you know, as we think about tariffs and tariff exclusions and rethinking this, you clearly have a point of view. Is there a thought about how we would manage through these 201, 301 tariffs to enhance competitiveness?
Well, I think the first step is the exclusion process. That's a clunky thing. It is individual companies petitioning, saying, here's a particular product we need and we can't get. I believe there is something like 90,000 of those petitions during the last administration. That would be the first step. And the second step, I think, would be to think through what is it we want to achieve with China and where are our core priorities. The approach that the last administration chose in the what they call the phase 1 agreement, I think, was not a particularly good one. China is, you know, a lot of it involves exporting targets. China is a big importer. They are not quite as large an importer as we are, but buy lots of ag products, buy lots of services, buy lots of manufactured goods. The problem that initiated the 301 case was a particular set of abuses, often in the digital world, often in the investment world, meant to extract technology. And you can add some other challenges. Ambassador Tais laid out some in a speech he gave at CSIS. But I think we should try to think through first, what do we want to achieve? Not feel that we're pinned to this export targeting concept. And maybe as an opening, the reason we have so many 301 tariffs is not because the 301 case imposed them all. It's because there was this following on rounds of retaliations, and you hit me and I'll hit you and then I'll hit you back. And maybe those, we can start by looking at some of those follow-on rounds that went beyond the core bounds of 301 case and see whether we can de-escalate a little bit in those areas.
Yeah, makes sense. I'm looking at the questions and shifting topics a bit. We haven't really talked about some of the challenges we've been having with supply chains that have actually also called into question, do we have the right structure for competitiveness if we're so tied to just in time? And Caitlin had a question actually about all of the challenges we're having now exporting with, goods coming in and empty containers going abroad. Do you all have any thoughts about, and this is a challenge, where are there policies that we need to implement to make sure we don't get into this situation again? And two, to facilitate those exports, which are so important for competitiveness? Or we just have to wait till the kinks work out?
I have two ideas. One is with respect to Caitlin Siganothi's question about how do you have, when you have a situation where you have exporters with cargoes are ready to pay and ready to go, and the ocean carrier doesn't want to take them because the price for exporting a container is $3,000 and for importing one is $15,000. The House has actually passed a bill on this called the Ocean Shipping Reform Act, and sponsored by Representatives Garamendi and Dusty Johnson, which says, among other things, if there is a waiting export cargo, and it doesn't require the ship to delay, the ship has to take it. And that's sort of similar to what we do in a lot of industries, like in taxis. We don't say the taxi company can decide only to go back and forth from Mayflower to Dulles. It has to serve the neighborhoods. So that's something the House has passed pretty strongly, and I believe the administration supports it. Otherwise, the challenges a long bit of work through the infrastructure bill to ramp up the quality of our ports and go from there. That's not something that can be done quickly. So there is going to be a lot of waiting this out and working through the kinks.
Yeah, I know. Okay, all right. I wanted to go ahead, and then I want to bring Chad in on this. And I know our next panel is on supply chain, so I don't want to go too down this rabbit hole, but your perspective is so interesting. Go ahead, Irit, and then
no,
Chad,
this is just a very tiny piece. Obviously, the supply chain issue is extremely complex, and there's so many aspects to it. But I do think a couple of things. Quick to Ed's point on China. Having good digital rules, I think, is an important way to address some of the China technology issues. And two, digitization of a lot of the customs and trade facilitation pieces will really, again, it's a piece of the supply chain. But, if you start to go with paperless invoicing, digital cut rules of origin, digital SPS certificates, you eliminate a lot of you just make things easier and faster.
Yeah, certainly we've seen that throughout the pandemic, and we've seen it with eFIDO for sanitary and phytosanitary, where you can immediately trace back to the original certification.
And
Chad,
did you have globally?
Thoughts on this and how you guys are managing with these disruptions? I know the chips issues and all of these challenges have been in front and center.
Yeah, not a lot to say on the export container piece, but on the, on the imports on supply chain, it's been incredibly important and a really valuable learning experience over the last year. That just in time is great, except when things don't get there on time. Don't want to steal the thunder for the next panel, but from a manufacturing perspective, resilience has become way more important than it was in the past, and is factored into a lot of are planning, and we've made public announcements on a number of the key components for electric vehicles that we're planning to localize, and all that takes time and takes investment, and in some cases you need a critical mass of other industries to make it make sense and to get the suppliers here. But I'd say especially for the must-have enterprise critical projects, resilience is priority number one. For some of the things that are maybe nice to haves, then you can still focus on efficiency. But it's become important not just for semiconductors, but for raw materials and key components and even some of the low tech components. So it's an important part of the discussion and one of the things that we're talking about every day.
Got it. So I see we're coming a little bit up on time. I kind of wanted to ask one rounding out question in terms of, we've heard a lot about rethinking trade policy, worker-centered trade policy, but we're not negotiating in many ways new agreements. We have an idea of frameworks in the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, but if we're not going back to negotiating traditional trade agreements, how do you actually implement some of these ideas that we've been talking about, other than sort of investments, which are critically important in U.S. infrastructure, training, and jobs? I mean, I think it's one thing to posit this, but then how do we actually implement this? And if you had one or two recommendations for the good people at USTR and Commerce and NSC, what would it be to actually jumpstart this? And now that we've had sort of a year of reflection, to really put these thoughts into action. And I'll start with Chad, because you're on my screen.
Thanks. Yeah, I mean, I think the focus on domestic policy, especially on the climate change space, incredibly important. And then, I think that's priority 1, 2, and 3. And then 4 is supply chain. Working with industry and suppliers and foreign partners to help build out the a resilient local and allied supply chain is incredibly important too.
Great. Ori?
Yeah, I mean, obviously the domestic piece is key, but I think there's a lot you can do globally short of a traditional trade agreement. And I know that, these are some of the things that USTR is looking at, especially in their new Indo-Pacific economic framework. We can look for agreements on worker labor standards, environmental standards, look to agreements on corruption, digital standards, supply chain issues, as we've talked about. So I think there's a lot that we can do that, with things that aren't traditional agreements, agreements to, let's say, limit subsidies for fossil fuels, and a whole range of things like that we can do that are, not traditional trade agreements or plurilateral, and are more agreements on things, a lot of things that maybe people would even call trade adjacent issues.
Yeah.
But I think have a big impact on trade.
I hear that. I think the question where I'm struggling with is, if you have these agreements and they're binding, how are they enforceable? If you don't have kind of a market access side, et cetera, and what are the tools that you need to use to think about how do you make these new agreements enforceable? I don't know, Jeff, if you have thoughts about any of it and all of that.
Well, one thing worth saying is that a lot of the folks on the academic side who are talking about what more enforceable trade agreements or what socially inclusive trade agreements might look like, so your Greg Schaefer's or your Donnie Roderick's or folks like that, they're not just talking about something like the controversies swirling around trade remedies. They're also including things like tax policy, which we haven't mentioned yet. There's a whole other thing we won't get into at this late stage, but there's tax policies, whether that's corporate or other forms of tax policy. There are other ways to approach redistribution and to provide those social safety nets that folks on this panel have already stressed being important. So again, it's not just about, what are your tariff levels or when are you allowed to use anti-dumping or not, but then this wider set of policies that might soften kind of the harsh blow of globalization, sometimes on the losers from free trade. And then just in one final breath, if I may, because I opened my comments today with talking about the importance of volatility, it's just another way of advertising the importance of the next panel. Volatility is one of the number one things that's cost jobs in this country and depressed wages. And where does volatility come from? Well, in part, it comes from not having diversified supply chains or relying too much on particular trade partners for your vital inputs. So again, just kind of lots of moving parts in that conversation, but thinking broadly about trade-related policies and thinking about the fundamental structure of our trade relationships around the world, both important.
Great. Ed, to you for the final word.
Okay, well, a couple of things, maybe three things. One is, I do think ultimately we need agreements and negotiations. If it is a concern that the U.S. Manufacturing and ag will be at a tariff disadvantage in Asia Pacific and Africa, that's a concern you can't solve without some agreements. So I think that has to come. I think there are a lot of things that you can do in trade policy that aren't enforceable and aren't agreements, but are quite important. That we have lots and lots of trade and investment framework agreements and dialogues where we talk about best practices in sanitary and phytosanitary standards, in technical barriers to trade, in digital security, cybersecurity, and digital access. Those sorts of things don't need enforcement as such because they're often quite good for the countries involved. And trade facilitation is another example. And last thing I'll say is, we've had a lot of this focus on tariffs and so forth over the past 4 years. One of my concerns has always been that the American tariff system is quite antiquated and quite regressive, and we're taxing a lot of products that are not made here and only bought by poor people. And it's not a system we should be very proud of. And I would love it if we would take a bit of time to take a look at and say there's some things we should probably purge out of this without regard to what foreigners do.
Got it. Thank you so much. Yeah, I absolutely agree. I don't know if Ken is still on, if he wants to jump on just for the final word. If not, I did want to thank our panelists so much for their thoughtful and insightful comments today on a pretty broad topic. Hopefully we've set up the next panel well in terms of digging into some of these supply chain issues, but really appreciate your perspective and your wise advice for us as we continue to muddle through and think through really what I think we all want, which is how do we have a trade policy that works for everybody? So Ken, over to you.
Thank you very much, Sarah. Thank you, Orit. Thank you, Jeff, Chad. Pleasure to have you on for the first time. Hope to have both of you back. Ed, welcome back onto the WIDA stage as well. Real pleasure to have all of you. Thank you. We covered a lot of ground on this panel, a lot of different topics to hit. So really grateful to all of you for your willingness to jump around. Sarah, I know you had a tech problem. I had one right before the whole day started, so it seems to be going around. Not like the coronavirus, but maybe some kind of computer bugs. Everyone, please take care of yourself. We're just going to have a very short 1-minute break before our next panel. Panel 1, thanks. You can shut off your cameras. We'll invite the other panel on in just a moment. Hello, everybody, and welcome back. Really grateful to our first panel and really excited to hear from our second panel. We're going to continue our discussion today, looking at one of the most important issues impacting U.S. and world trade, the disruption of global supply chains caused by COVID, especially. We got into it a little bit in the first panel, but this is really where we're going to do a much deeper dive. Before I introduce our panel, and want to ask them to please turn on their cameras. Before I introduce them, though, we'd like to welcome and call out a couple more of the guests who are here with us today in our audience. Not on camera, Rory Heslington with Autos Drive America, Chris Denzel with DHL Express, Sarah Dean with John Deere, and Virginia Gum with the Aluminum Association. Welcome, Rory, Chris, Sarah, and Virginia. And welcome to our panel. Trade doesn't often make the front page of America's newspapers, but disruptions in the global supply chains have caught everyone's attention. I'm delighted to welcome today's panel to unpack some of the critical issues impacting global supply chains and hopefully give us some ideas about ways to solve some of those disruptions. So welcome, first of all, back to the WIDA stage to John Gold, Vice President of Supply Chain and Customs Policy at the National Retail Federation. Welcome back as well to Phil Levy, Chief Economist at Flexport and formerly a Senior Economist for Trade for the President's Council of Economic Advisors. Welcome to Penny Noss, President of International Public Affairs and Sustainability at UPS and one of our leadership sponsors for our conference. Thank you so much for all your support, Penny. Maria Zebo, Assistant Vice President of International Affairs at the National Pork Producers Council, also another supporter of this conference. Thank you so much, Maria and the pork producers. And our moderator, Anna Swanson, a correspondent for the New York Times, who has written about many aspects of supply chain disruptions over the past few months. We're delighted to have you all here today. Anna?
Thank you so much, Ken. These WIDA events are always a little like homecoming for trade people. So really delighted to be back here. And I hope next year, maybe we can gather in person. So I've always been fascinated by supply chain issues, but I think for a lot of people, there's been a new appreciation with the pandemic that when you click on something on Amazon, it doesn't just show up on your doorstep the next day by magic. There's this whole complicated global machinery that whirs into life to deliver that good exactly when and where you want it. And some people would argue that this system has continued operating very smoothly, given the challenges that the world is facing right now. But obviously, there are also major signs of stress beyond just your shortages of cream cheese and Pelotons. Supply chain challenges are one of the biggest factors right now that are holding back economic growth and pushing inflation to a 40-year high. So that's a major challenge for businesses and policymakers alike. I'd like to get into some of these topics with this fantastic panel. Let me start with some of the issues, what the issues in the supply chain look like right now. And then a little later, we'll turn to some potential solutions. We definitely want to get into audience questions as well. So please put those in the Q&A tab of the Zoom. Let me start with you, Phil. When we say supply chain disruptions, what are we talking about? How are you measuring supply chain disruptions at Flexport? And what are some of the root causes?
Yeah, great. Thank you very much, Anna, and thank you, Ken. I think the problem has been maybe not enough whirring and too much sputtering, as you put it. I think one of the lessons that we've had from the pandemic is how you really have a supply chain and each link can be subject to difficulties. And we saw that from early on, where it was at the very beginning in the spring of 2020, could you get workers to factories? Were things being supplied? Then could you transport goods from the factories to the ports? Were there planes available or ships to move things from port to port, and then warehousing, trucking, all of these? We've had interruptions that have come because it's hard to get workers. We've had, and sometimes that's induced by either the pandemic directly or indirectly. We've had port closures. We've had ships stuck. How does that all? So, which then begs the question: okay, fine, those are a lot of impediments. What does it all add up to, and how well is the system functioning? I think there's a couple of measures one can look at. The one that's gotten a lot of attention initially was prices, that it just became very expensive. Things where people had assumed that you could move goods relatively cheaply, maybe pay $1,500 to move a container across the Pacific. You were seeing $15,000. So a 10x move in prices. That's certainly one indication of the challenge. The thing that we've put out at Flexport to try and give a direct measure is also a measure of time, which is how long does it take to get from cargo ready at the factory, when it's ready to leave the factory, to when is it picked up from its destination port. And what we've seen is that there has been a very marked increase in the amount of time. And that's actually not just a US thing. We measure it to North America and we measure it to Europe. And in each case, you've seen a dramatic increase. Just to quantify, pre-pandemic, this particular measure would be 40 to 50 days going across the Pacific from Asia to North America. The latest number that we just put out yesterday was 110 days. So, which clearly has an effect, as you say, somebody places an order and wants something to come, how full is the warehouse and how stocked are the shelves? So.
Great. Yeah, that's a great introduction. Penny, I want to go to you next because you have a really unique lens into the situation on the ground. So what is the situation that you're seeing at ports, and then how would you contrast that with capacity for rail and for trucking?
Anna, thanks so much. And Phil, thank you for kind of starting to set the scene for us. I think I'd like to just start with a fact, which is that no US port is in the top 50 globally in terms of productivity. So when you look at the US port system, and not every port is the same, but in general, we can see that the US port infrastructure maybe has not kept up with some of the other global trends that we see out there. So I think our port infrastructure is something that we do need to invest in. And by investing in, it doesn't just mean the hard infrastructure, but also some of the things around digitalization that are now entering into the international trade world. So I think our ports and complement that with infrastructure that needs to be provided in terms of roads and bridges and also airports. That's I think a very important thing that we all need to focus on. And I know Sarah mentioned it on the previous panel as well. So I'd like to start with infrastructure, followed by transparency and digitalization. Again, this is something we need to invest in, but what we're seeing around the world is a lot more digitalization being injected into logistics. And again, that is not something that we've always kept up with in the United States. So that's another point I think that we just need to keep an eye on. And then last is the people. And I think Phil referenced it with regards to workers, but we've just been in a very complex environment with regards to labor. And again, supply chains are really driven by people. And I think that we need to think about how you combine some of the issues around people with how we move supply chains around the world if we want to tackle some of these issues. So Anna, I think I'll leave it there to start, but and I appreciate the conversation today.
Great, yeah. John, turning to you, how are these disruptions impacting importers? For retailers, the supply chain challenges have often resulted from surging consumer demand, but there are a lot of challenges as well, right?
Yeah, thanks, Anna. Thanks, Ken, for the invitation to participate today. And just to tie into what Phil and Penny were talking about, I mean, in general, the challenge right now is that the consumer demand is just far outpacing the available supply of everything that's needed to not only just make, but move both finished goods as well as inputs to production. This has led to massive supply chain disruptions that have been going on throughout the pandemic. To be honest, many of the challenges that we're facing today actually existed before the pandemic, but they've been further exacerbated because of the challenges that we're seeing. Port congestion, chassis availability, the situation with empty containers. Those were all things we've been working on previously that just hadn't gotten the attention that they're getting today. It continues to be a challenge, and those are key areas we need to continue to focus on. For retailers, the end result has been that the retailers have looked for ways to mitigate the impact of the disruptions and have always been looking to do that. They really engaged before the holiday shipping season to make sure that there were products on the store shelves for Christmas. But even earlier on in the pandemic, trying to adjust for some of those goods that were really hot that folks were looking for. So some of the strategies that retailers sought to employ was shipping early, looking at alternate ports, not just relying on LA Long Beach, but looking at East Coast and Gulf Coast as well, looking for alternate modes of transportation. So air freight certainly picked up throughout the pandemic as well, and looking at alternate sourcing. But that certainly has some challenges with it, whether it's onshore, near shore, or just looking to other places within Asia. Retailers continue to make significant investments in their supply chains and overall operations to make sure they're meeting consumer needs. We kind of joked early on that we saw 5 years worth of innovation within the first 5 months of the pandemic, as many retailers were forced to shut down and rely on e-commerce that many hadn't had really fully developed e-commerce plans yet. So you saw the advent of things like buy online, pick up in store, curbside pickup that really hadn't been on the plan for many retailers until a couple of years down the road. But those, have taken off and continue to be a good service that retailers offer today. But, in general, across the board, retailers saw delays throughout their supply chain at every step along the way. They've seen cost increases at every step along the way, and they're continuing to plan for that now, not just looking at what's happening today, but trying to plan for the future and build more resiliency into their supply chains.
Yeah, that's a great point. There's been a lot of transformation in the industry. And I do want to talk about reshoring, nearshoring. But first, Maria, a lot of the focus has been on imports. Tell me about the kinds of bottlenecks that we're seeing for US exports.
Yeah, thanks, Anna. And thanks, Wida, for inviting me to discuss these supply chain issues, and the other panelists, Phil and Penny and John, for setting the stage. So for US agriculture, we've faced a lot of ups and downs over the past few years. And it's been exacerbated by the COVID-19 pandemic, like John mentioned. For us specifically, for US ag and for pork exports, we've certainly faced a lot of issues exporting our products. Phil mentioned this, container prices are on average 170% higher than a year ago. But we're still continuing to face that last minute cancellation of shipments, as the previous panel talked about. This really does create that bottleneck as we get set to export a product and a carrier decides to go back to Asia and not carry agricultural goods. That leads to a bottleneck beyond just the product, the perishable product sitting at a port. But also we're seeing that cold storage facilities at ports are already at capacity. It's going beyond the ports, but also we're dealing with chassis availability. And then when shipments get canceled, we have the detention and demurrage charges, and then trying to figure out how are we going to get this product into cold storage and to find the available labor of the truckers to move product around. So it's certainly been an issue for us that we've had to deal with for over a year now. And the other part of this is there are some countries like China who also have a zero tolerance policy for COVID. So if they have a couple of COVID outbreaks from workers at a terminal, that terminal shuts down. So now there's a bottleneck waiting for our ag products to be offloaded in that country, the receiving country. So it's certainly been a large effects. And then I'd say that I would be remiss in not adding that on top of all these issues at the ports, we're still facing the trade retaliation of a 25% retaliatory duty into China. So while the rest of the world on pork, at least, is paying a 12% duty, we're having to pay a 37% duty into China, which is not making us very competitive. And as Secretary Vilsack said yesterday during his announcement, the U.S. is really looking at losing market access into some of these key markets, and it's making us less competitive, and somebody has to eat the cost of all these additional fees and these bottlenecks. And unfortunately, we're seeing that at retail.
And so I understand that supply chain bottlenecks are also creating an issue for farmers in terms of rising input prices. How are farmers and ranchers dealing with issues like inflation, worker shortages, some of the other economic constraints that they're looking at right now?
Yeah, so, we talk a lot about exports, but we're not talking too much about the imports and the supply chain disruptions on our imports. Key nutrients that are added to the feeds, vitamins, minerals, that sort of thing. Some of these are 4 times higher than a year ago. And we're even facing disruptions in plastics and plastic ear tags for our hogs, so we could differentiate them. And in the fall, we saw some disruptions in plastic packaging. So these are all the things that are adding to the price that you're seeing at the grocery store. I'd also like to, it's really important that when we talk about the inputs going up, that we're also have to talk about the issue that we're having on labor, which is we are really, really struggling to find labor, and we don't have a visa program for non-degree holding ag workers and that are for year round to work on hog farms and packing plants. So there's a couple of things that have been done. USDA has recently announced a $1 billion loan program, a guarantee loan program for grants as well to extend packing capacity in the United States. And that's really positive as long as the proper balance is struck with these plans. But it's the issue is always going to come back to, are we going to have the labor to work at these hog farms and packing plants? So I'd say that producers are facing a lot of volatility from the retaliatory tariffs still in effect, the increases in inputs because of the supply chain disruptions, and then on top of that, you have to add on the labor scarcity.
John, I'm sure labor is a major issue for your members as well. You mentioned that you had done a survey of your members. What are they expecting for trends for 2022?
Yeah, we've done a couple of different benchmarking surveys with our members to look at the ongoing issues and see how they're being impacted. I wish I had good news coming out of this survey as far as what's going to happen in 2022. But I think many who responded to the survey expect more of the same in 2022. Many don't expect the disruptions to subside until later on in 2022, maybe Q4. And that's because there's still a lot of uncertainty about what's happening in the supply chain, a lot of uncertainty over the pandemic and the impact of the pandemic. We just went through the Omicron surge, and it's what's next? What's the next variant that's going to impact and have an impact? We talked about, the China having the zero tolerance for COVID. The little shutdown they have has an impact and it ripples throughout the supply chain. I think the good news there, though, is unfortunately or fortunately, China is much better at getting things back up and running in their ports than we are. And part of that is because of the technology, automation, digitization they have at their ports, which is something that we need to continue to push and to talk about. But with regards to what our members think are going to be continuing in 2022, the top three issues they cite are U.S. port congestion, workforce shortages, again, throughout the supply chain, and then ocean carrier capacity. Again, we're looking at imports to continue to increase in 2022, not at the double-digit rate we saw in 2021, but we're looking at single-digit increases for this year. The global port tracker that we just put out, again, calls for single-digit. But you've got to take a look back at what happened in 2020 and 2021 because of that strong consumer demand. You saw an uptick in 2020 in imports, put us up at about 22 million TEUs, which was a record of imports coming into the US. And then last year, we saw that rise up to 26 million TEUs, which are just unheard of numbers coming through our ports. And despite those record numbers, I give credit to Longshoremen and others working at the ports being able to put through the throughput. We still have challenges, but they're the folks on the front line and applaud them for all the work they're doing. But again, folks still see high inventory levels, which is going to be a challenge, especially with lack of available warehouse space. And then again, looking at transportation costs across the board, increasing or being higher again in 2022. But retailers are continuing to plan ahead. And one other disruption issue that we're looking at that folks are already starting to plan for now is the fact that we have a labor contract negotiation set for July with the West Coast labor negotiations. The contract is set to expire in July, and folks are already starting to plan now because there's a history of disruption tied around those events. We certainly hope the parties will get to the table early and negotiate and not engage in any kind of disruption issues. But folks aren't taking any chances, and they're going to plan accordingly to make sure they don't get caught if there are any kind of further disruptions on the West Coast.
Yeah, that will be really important to follow, because in the past we have seen, work slowdowns and an impact on supply chains from that, and it comes at a really fragile time for the supply chain, right? So we'll be watching that closely.
Well, and just add, it does come at a fragile time because, again, this gets
Yeah.
back to the time of the peak shipping season for retailers as retailers start to bring in their holiday merchandise. So that's going to further potentially impact the port fluidity.
Are you already seeing folks look at other ports on the other coast?
Yeah, I mean, that diversification has been ongoing throughout the pandemic, and this is just going to further push folks to look at that diversification.
Really interesting. Yeah. Penny, I wanted to ask you how you're seeing customers structure and plan their supply chains around some of these events. And how are companies managing their inventory for whatever they think is coming this year?
Yeah, so I think that's a great question. And I think there's a debate around just in time versus just in case. And whether we have seen an increase in inventories and people increasing their inventories. Part of the GDP increase was attributed to people rebuilding and or building anew certain inventories of goods. What we're seeing on that front as well is I think two things in particular I'd like to focus on. First is transparency around your supply chain. I think all of us have discovered that it's kind of a basic risk principle, but that you really need to know where all the components in your supply chain are coming from. And for a variety of reasons, whether it's some of the new rules around prohibitions on forced labor from certain regions of China, to issues around certain cities shutting down due to COVID. So, Vietnam shut down and that for a certain period, and that then had follow-on effects for a lot of companies that may not have realized that they had certain components that were being made in Vietnam that were going to shut things down. So I think overall, what we're seeing is our customers putting a renewed focus on really digging in and trying to understand their full supply chain to a level that maybe they haven't in the past, including down to kind of where the factory is, where things are. And once they're getting that transparency, I think what we're seeing is something that was already there before the pandemic, which was a move towards more intra-regional trade. So pre-pandemic, we were already moving in that direction. And I think that as we move into the post-pandemic era, again, I think without the ability to travel, shifting supply chains at times can be a challenge because you really do need to, again, go back to that transparency, see your factories, make sure that the practices they're following are the things that you as a purchaser or an end manufacturer want to see. But I think that that's another really important piece is that as we come out of this and travel resumes, I think we're really anticipating, I don't want to call it nearshoring, but a continued move towards that regionalization of supply chains. And lastly, I think trade policy is also going in that direction with, kind of multilateralism not moving very quickly at the moment. We are seeing a lot of activity with regional trade agreements. And I think that that's also creating some of the incentives, whether it be RCEP and some of the innovations that come in the RCEP agreement. It's really pushing, I think, people to look again for regional suppliers that maybe come with, what they believe will be slightly less complex logistics of getting goods from one place to the other.
Okay, great. And I do want to get more into those supply chain shifts. But first, I wanted to ask Phil, these supply chain challenges have been a lot longer lasting than some people have anticipated. But what do you see now as the scenarios whereby this would clear, and how would we know if it is getting better?
Yeah, good question. And it gets back to something I might have neglected when you asked me earlier, which is what is the root cause? But John addressed it well, that you have a situation where demand is exceeding the capacity to supply things. That could come from one of two possibilities. It could be that you're having regular demand and the supply chain is just breaking down, or it could be that you're having unusually large levels of demand and the supply chain just isn't able to keep up. And I think John also gave us the statistics as to why we probably think it's the latter. because when you're seeing record levels of imports and you're seeing, consumer goods consumption hit extraordinary levels, this is suggesting a system that's sort of overwhelmed by demand. I think it's worth keeping in mind that this is not uncommon when you have a system that requires lots of investment up front, that you build it to handle a certain peak capacity, not to have lots and lots and lots of excess capacity. So here we get a surge that has taken us beyond peak capacity for a really prolonged period, where the norm is that you just hit that, as John talked about, when you have retailers stocking up for the holidays, that there's a tough time of year. The whole year has been that way. The upshot has been that not only have we had sort of current congestion, but we have backlogs, that we have a lot of containers waiting to be moved. So how does this clear? How do we get out of this? What's the scenario? I don't think we do it without a decrease in demand for goods, which can come through an overall decrease in what people are spending, or it can come through a shift back from how much they're spending on goods relative to services. Traditionally, we're nearly a 70% services economy. That pulled back during the pandemic, and there was a shift towards goods, and that's where a lot of the strain is coming from. So I think you get a decrease in demand at some point, and then it has to occur at the right point. So if you got that decrease in demand right on the eve of peak season, that doesn't really give you that extra capacity to clear a backlog. And so it has to come at the right point in the year where, here's some breathing space, we clear the backlog. How will we know that this has happened? Well, that's why we did things like Flexport's Ocean Timeliness Indicator, is we're just tracking how long does it take to get from cargo ready to destination port pickup. We know what the sort of normal times were pre-pandemic. If we return to those, so instead of 110 days, we're talking about 45, that'll be a sign that we've managed to set things right, I think.
Great. And Phil, we did have one audience question from Marley at International Trade Today that might be a good fit for you. And if others want to jump in here, please feel free. But she asked, how much of an effect have anti-dumping and Section 301 tariffs on chassis had on straining the supply chain? Do you have any thoughts on that?
We've already had mention of there being a shortage. I think Maria was talking about the difficulty of finding chassis. That's very real. I don't think it helps in any way to sort of put tariffs on goods that are in short supply. That's sort of just doing harm to ourselves. I can't quantify exactly how much that's done, but yeah, it's a real concern. And so I think you can see this in two directions. You've got serious congestion, which means that a lot of chassis are being taken up holding things. What are your options at that point? You could try to clear the congestion and make things flow better. One certainly ought to do that. But if it were possible at low cost to bring in more chassis, that would help. And it's unfortunate when the government makes that more expensive.
And if I can jump in here too, I mean, everything when I talk to truckers and ports and everybody else, they all talk about this being a significant impact, and those tariffs coming in at the worst time possible, impacting the supply chain, because as we know, there is currently a chassis shortage, and part of this is just the lack of number of chassis available, but the fact that many chassis are sitting under empty containers that are just either sitting at the port, sitting outside the port, taking up valuable space. And the fact that you have a 221%, AD/CVD tariff on top of these chassis, nobody's bringing in chassis anymore. And the domestic providers aren't going to be able to meet the demand, from what I heard, until 2024. So we're going to go another year having a chassis shortage because of this.
Mm-hmm. Well, this gets to a question I wanted to pose to all of you, which is that we've seen the Biden administration try to take various steps to address supply chain bottlenecks and inflation. Are there any of these efforts that you would point to as more or less successful? Anything that you think is particularly needed? How much government influence does the government actually wield when it comes to dealing with supply chain issues? Whoever would like to, anyone want to jump in on that big question?
I'm happy to start. Look, we appreciate the attention the administration is paying to supply chains now. I think it was a positive step to name John Picari as the White House ports envoy to try and address some of the challenges. But the challenges are immense, and there's a lot that needs to be done. There's no single silver bullet that's going to fix everything. I think, as we've already talked about, it's like every step along the way, there's a challenge we have to get worked out. I think what the administration needs to continue to do is basically use the bully pulpit and get the right stakeholders in a room and trying to address some of these challenges, again, that existed well before the pandemic. I think focusing on things like digitization that Penny was talking about, that I think we're going to talk a little bit about later too, is critical. And, we've got to figure out a better way going forwards, because I think, as Penny addressed too, we can't build our way out of this challenge physically. Our ports are kind of at their max right now. We've got to figure out how do we make ourselves more productive, more efficient, more resilient. And part of that is by using better data, better and more timely data, but also looking at some of the key agencies that have enforcement abilities to address some of these challenges, like the Federal Maritime Commission, and addressing some of the challenges with detention demurrage, which have skyrocketed and have led to increased costs throughout the pandemic. Look, we fully support detention demurrage as a mechanism to move containers quickly or return equipment quickly, but you can't do that when you've got a fully congested port. But yet you've got these charges being laid on many shippers and truckers for issues that are beyond their control. And so I think those are issues we need to take a look at. So again, looking at things like passing the Ocean Shipping Reform Act of 2021, another thing that we think needs to happen that the administration fully supports. The House passed it overwhelmingly. Now we need the Senate to act. We think these are some common sense reforms that are going to help address some of the business practices that have developed over the past couple of years. It's not going to be that panacea fixing everything now, but we'll address some of these behaviors that need to be changed looking now and in the future.
Anyone else want to jump in there? I was just thinking about, because thinking about the containers that are stuck on chassis, the administration has started kind of a variety of pop-up container yards and, threats of fines for long dwelling containers. Do you think any of that has actually moved the needle? Or are we really talking about longer term, bigger investments in port infrastructure, digitization, as you're saying, to make a difference?
Yeah, I think on the dwell fees, the fees that have been proposed for LA and Long Beach, those have been threatened to be put on the carriers, who then turned around and threatened to put them on the importers. I think so. Again, looking at passing the buck. I think many of the larger retailers have been working to move their containers, those that have been sitting for a while. But look, they've got long free time because of the contracts they've negotiated with the carriers. So trying to work through some of those challenges and issues. You've got individual terminals that are now looking to put their own excessive dwell fees in place that are very different than what the ports have put in place. And, from what I've seen from a few emails that have come across, again, they're being applied unfairly and not giving importers enough time to be able to go in and get those containers when they want to get them. There's now a threat of putting new fees on long dwelling empty containers. There's been so much focus on getting the loaded containers out of the terminal that we have not paid enough attention to the hundreds of thousands of empty containers that are just sitting idle, again, either at the terminals or sitting out in somebody's yard. I know Maria's members and other ag folks would love to have those empty containers to get them back over to Asia, or just evacuate those containers because there's a container shortage in Asia as well. So we've got to figure out, how do we balance, all these issues? And I think we've got to put more attention on those empties, again, that create problems not only just overseas, but take up valuable space in the yard and don't allow for the longshoremen to do better planning in the yard and move the containers around and be able to get that throughput that we need.
Yeah,
Maria, did you have it? Oh, sorry.
No, I was going to say, I agree with a lot what John was saying. And I think the one thing that we certainly need to see is the Senate take up the OSRA, Ocean Shipping Reform Act. The provisions that are ag specific, that Representatives Mendy and Dusty Johnson wrote in the House bill, it passed overwhelmingly and are going to do a lot of good for our industry. And we would love to see the Senate take up a very similar version to that. But yesterday, aside from that, you had asked previously about what the administration is doing, and USDA did announce yesterday a joint ventureship with the Port of Oakland. They're going to be setting up a 25-acre site to allow U.S. companies to fill those empty shipping containers with U.S. products. We think that a lot of that is going to go towards ag. And then, of course, USDA is fronting a lot of the startup costs, the 60% of startup costs, and additional $125 per container. So that's really good news, especially for my guys who are exporting fresh pork to Japan. Oakland is actually one of the big terminals where we're exporting that high value fresh pork to Japan. And what we've seen over the last few years, and especially last year, is that a lot of the carriers decided to just bypass Oakland to avoid the delays that they were facing. And that really put in jeopardy that Japanese access that, as we all know, we fought really hard under TPP, then we finally got under that Japan-US phase 1. But all of that is at risk if we can't get our pork out into containers and out through Oakland. So the announcement yesterday by the secretary is really good news for us, and hopefully we can start seeing more containers being cleared and the process moving forward a lot quicker and getting better efficiencies, like John was saying.
And Maria, I was curious, what did you think about the Biden administration's efforts to increase competition in meat processing?
Well, for our industry, we certainly love to hear about more packing capacity. It's always really good for our industry. But I'd say that first, we talked a lot about food price inflation. There's a paper that was just recently published by Iowa State and North Carolina State and MPPC that tracked food price inflation. And we found that, or the paper found that the economists found that pork prices have been rising because of, one, strong demand for US pork, but also the higher input costs and labor shortages. And so we certainly would need to see some of those issues addressed. I think that when it comes to concentration in the meat packing industry, over the past 5 years, we've actually seen that our pork producers have been building new packing plants. And it's quite interesting that we've seen this, and what led to building of new packing plants and deconcentration is actually years ago, when the United States was in the middle of negotiating the Trans-Pacific Partnership, our producers saw that there was going to be tremendous potential for exports to Southeast Asia. So a few of them decided to open their own packing plants, and that's how we've seen and invest in that. And over the last few years, we've seen 5 new packing plants come online, most of which are producer owned. And this has really created a pretty good opportunity for us. So it's certainly something that we want to work with the Biden administration on more packing capacity, as I mentioned earlier. But just a figure I do want to throw out there is that according to the Department of Justice, they have an index that they look at concentration, and they measure concentration for specific sectors. And any sort of score that is 1,500 and below means that it's not concentrated. And pork packing plants actually fall on a score of 1,300 or so, 1,350. So it's certainly, we want to work with the Biden administration, but we are in a position where we're not seeing as much of that concentration, at least on the pork packing side of things.
I did want to remind the audience to go ahead and submit questions in the Q&A tab. We have another audience question from Daniel Pearson. To what extent do inefficiencies at U.S. container ports relate to opposition from organized labor to the adoption of more advanced technologies? Does the country need to consider further policy changes at ports? I think is a good question here. Maybe Penny or Phil, any thoughts on potential policy changes in the situation at ports? Or automation as well. It seems like this question is getting to trends to automation at ports as well.
Bill, do you want to go first? Or
Sure, I'm happy to. I think what we can say is that, as was cited earlier, our ports are not, the U.S. ports are not the most efficient in the world. That means there's room for improvement, and I think one can examine a whole series of things that would make those ports more efficient, and it's important that we do. I don't think that the discussion earlier captured it well. I don't think that's a short-term solution to the problem, but I think it is a worthwhile goal. I think some of the measures the Biden administration has put forward are constructive. Investment in infrastructure is constructive. One can look and see about sort of the way things are processed. I don't know that we have an immediate fix or want to micromanage the operation of ports, but there's clearly improvement that can be made.
Mhm. And Penny, you had kind of touched on this earlier, but maybe you could talk a bit about the trends that you're seeing in terms of automation as well as reshoring.
Yeah, so maybe just to follow up a little bit on Phil and John's point. So going all the way kind of back to what can the Biden administration do? I think one of the most important things they can do is they've got the convening power, because this involves localities, states, federal, and international. So if you really want to address some of these issues, you've got to look at it in all these different ways, and bringing all the parties together to talk about it is the only way you're really gonna address this. Now, with regards to longshoremen and labor, I mean, the one thing I think we have seen in the past few months is that there's a war for talent, and that there are, we are a very large Teamster company, proudly Teamster company at UPS, and having a strong labor contract has provided some stability in terms of wages during the past year for us as a company. It's also because of the conditions that we have and other things, we've had lower turnover at UPS. So I would just say that when we look at some of these labor issues, there's also, I think, going to Phil's point, there's clearly some inefficiencies that we need to be looking at in these ports. But I would just throw out that we've got to look at this holistically with local, state, federal, and some international to make sure that we're putting together the most efficient ports possible. I was going to cite one very specific example that we're involved with at the Port of LA and Long Beach called Accelerate Cargo. And through this program, we're providing advanced data on behalf of all of our customers and sending that into the port to help with managing some of the cargo containers. And with it, we're supposed to see an increase of 20% greater efficiency with regards to the ability to move containers through the Port of LA, Port of Long Beach. So this is an ongoing program, one that we're working with them on today. But looking at some of these issues around tweaks of providing data in advance and allowing people to do more advanced planning, some of that's low-hanging fruit in terms of driving greater efficiency by pushing out some of these things, using data, pulling parties together to share data that they maybe in the past haven't, to create greater productivity in some of these ports.
Those are great points. Yeah, thank you so much. We did have another audience question here from Adam Barbina. Thanks for your thoughts. What are your thoughts on the impact of human rights laws on supply chains and where we are headed in the next few years? Would love some general thoughts, but John, I definitely wanted to ask you about the specific changes that companies are making ahead of the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act, which goes into effect in June and will apply a rebuttable presumption for goods made with in whole or in part from Xinjiang. So this is a major deal for retailers as well, right? How are companies responding in terms of looking at their supply chains ahead of that policy?
Thanks, Anne. I mean, it's a major deal for any company who's sourcing out of China, because it doesn't just impact in retail. It's any company that has any kind of link to Xinjiang. And obviously there are a couple of, withhold release orders that Customs has out now on things like apparel or, cotton and tomatoes and a few other things, polysilicon. But they're obviously looking at, any product that potentially is coming out of that region. I think in general, retailers are constantly looking at evaluating their supply chains. This started well before this, obviously with the China trade war. Folks were looking at shifting supply chains, with the further focus on the Uyghur situation that, had companies, again, reevaluating their supply chains, trying to make sure they don't have any connections. At the outset, companies don't want to employ or partner with anybody that engages in forced labor. I mean, that is priority number one as part of their CSR efforts, is ensuring they have clean supply chains. But obviously the challenge is trying to get back to the areas where you don't have direct contractor control. So looking at your, tier 3, tier 4, tier 5, all the way back through the supply chain. I think companies are trying to do their part now and looking at different track and trace technologies and have better controls over their supply chains, but it continues to be a challenge. On the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act, obviously, There's been a lot of discussion over the past couple of years with the enforcement that Customs has been doing with the WROs that are in place. Part of this is trying to get better information from Customs, the Department of Homeland Security, and the federal government as a whole as to how to address some of these issues and what do we need to do this. Better information. What are the challenges that we're seeing, and how can retailers help to address the challenges? I think the last thing folks want to do is just completely pull up and cut off there, because how does that help address forced labor? I think you want to try and correct any of these challenges that are out there. So trying to address some of these challenges that are there, looking to pilot and work with CBP on some of these track and trace technologies. I think there are a lot of companies doing a lot of good work, but we've got to make sure that whatever technologies are put in place actually do their job, and actually help address the situation. So a lot of companies are paying a lot of attention to this, trying to identify, dig deeper into their supply chains to get that better understanding of what's happening. But again, coming up with a lot of questions for CBP and the government as a whole as to how can we partner to address these situations. Because to be honest, to address the forced labor situation, it can't just be left upon the companies to enforce. I think we've got to work and have a whole of government approach to this. So again, looking forward to working with CBP on their enforcement strategy, and looking forward to the larger government strategy that's being put in place. I think USTR now has some work they're doing on a strategy, Department of Labor and others. We've got to make sure that we're all working together to address these challenges. I think it's a kind of a 3 or 4-legged stool when you look at how to address this. It's industry, it's the NGOs, and it's government, both our own, the U.S. government, as well as working with our allies as well. We all need to be part of a solution going forwards.
Right. And Penny, I did want to ask you as well what kind of changes you're seeing in terms of corporate social responsibility, companies pursuing environmental or social goals with their supply chains. What kind of changes are you seeing now?
Yes, thanks for that. I think that in general, going back, so building off this point on human rights, building off the points on transparency, what I think we're all seeing out there today is just a lot more focus by companies and by our customers, by governments, on what we would call ESG. That's environment, social, and governance. And so it's something that I think is really it's really growing in importance, and it's something that a lot of us are trying to really pivot quickly on, because the demands have grown kind of exponentially in a very short amount of time. First off, I want to go back to something John talked about though with ESG, and that's the role of the consumer. So what we're seeing is consumers who want a lot more socially responsible, environmentally friendly goods, but they're sometimes making contradictory decisions with regards to when they select and when they take products. And so one of the things that I think we really need to do is focus on how do we help educate the consumer on these issues and help them make the best choices based on what's important to them. What we're seeing in the transportation sector in particular is, again, going back to our theme of today, efficiency. The first and the most important thing you can do in supply chains is make them efficient. For every mile you're not flying, piloting a boat in, etc., you're saving fuel. So finding and driving efficiency in supply chains remains the absolute critical first step. And then above and beyond that, we're really looking at how can we employ more environmentally sustainable technologies in the future of transportation. And that's got a slightly longer, medium, and long-term trajectory. But that's become something that's very important. And again, we're hearing about it often from customers, also from our employees and from our investors. So this is, I think, an area that's going to continue to be important for anybody involved in trade. We're going to see more activity on climate change and trade agreements. So I think the interest in this issue is just rising exponentially, and it's something we're all going to have to think about moving forward as we continue to build supply chains and as we continue to look at trade.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the last few months have been actually the first time that I had to learn about carbon pricing and incorporate that into my trade reporting. So that's been kind of interesting to see the administration merge some of these environmental goals with trade goals, and companies as well, right? Make that change. Phil, I just want to ask you, we've seen a lot of conversation in Washington recently about the need to move supply chains out of China for a lot of different reasons, whether human rights issues in Xinjiang, national security considerations, environmental impact. But how much of that are we actually seeing? How much reshoring are we actually seeing right now?
Well, there's different things. There's a great question. There's moving out of China, and then there's sort of reshoring, which is the idea that we're going to have it either in the US or nearshoring right close. I think it's something where there's probably more political enthusiasm than we're seeing an actual movement. I think this is a time when, for all the reasons we've discussed throughout this session, businesses are wide open to looking at new possibilities. That, if you say, here's a new proposition, here's how you can do something in Central America, or here's how you can do something in Mexico, absolutely open to looking at that. The problem is that, what China had done was establish a system of servicing supply chains, which was quite and remains quite efficient. And it's also, one should remember, the second largest economy in the world. So, that's not easy to replace. And even within Asia, we saw a move there to, how about Vietnam? And there was a big push to get into Vietnam that was quite successful. I think Vietnam did well, but you quickly strain capacity. Vietnam is not as large as China is, and you can't automatically do this. And they don't have the infrastructure that China has developed over decades. It's changing, but you're not there yet. The other thing to keep in mind is there's a temptation, I think, to just sort of look at a map and say, Latin America is a lot closer. That must be easier. It's kind of the difference between, big interstate highways and back roads, that what you have going across the Pacific is the big interstate highway. Now, it may have been congested of late, it has been, but you don't have those highways as well established to other parts of the world. So there's people looking at it, they're thinking about that. The last thing I'll mention is there's really a fairly long checklist of things that businesses can and do consider for what is a good supplier. And it was mentioned earlier, the very good point about, can you travel? Can you check out what are the practices of the place? How reliable is a supplier? Will you have port interruptions? Will there be strikes? Will there be, other things that will block you from moving your product out? Will you be able to bring in the supplies that you need for the factories to do things? And so I think that's what you're getting businesses exploring. And so the answers aren't always that obvious. It's not simply a matter of how close or, at first blush, what is the cost? So that's a long-winded version. The short version is there's some, but I don't think it's anywhere near as much as it's appeared in the political rhetoric.
Yeah.
Okay, great.
And if I could just jump in there, just to tie into, Phil made a great point that all, that checklist, it takes time to go through that and fully evaluate any new vendor you're going to bring on board. Take months, if not years, to fully evaluate that, to make sure that, they meet the quantity, quality that you need for your products. The capacity issue that Phil raised, as far as nobody can replace the capacity that's in China. It's extremely difficult to do that. But the fact that during the pandemic, you couldn't go out and travel and go and physically verify makes it that much more difficult to switch your vendors. You can only do so much over Zoom and MS Teams, but so it's a challenge. But companies continue to look and evaluate. And, besides just the general, can they make what I want? Do they meet the quality that I want? Do they meet all the different health and safety requirements based upon US government rules? But do they have the infrastructure? Do they have the skilled workforce? Do they have the ports? Do they have the vessel rotations that need to happen? These are all considerations that go into this. And unfortunately, it takes time to build that out.
Great. And Maria, what about the agricultural supply chains? What changes do you think need to be made to better manage agricultural supply chains in the future? What would the ag community like to see?
I'd say that there's two things that come to top of mind. And one, it's for the Senate to introduce and pass the Ocean Shipping Reform Act. That's going to do a lot. There are a lot of provisions in the House version that will do a lot to alleviate the congestion that we're seeing at the ports and to speed up the ability to turn around cargo. And so we would love to see the Senate to take up that companion bill. And two, I'd be remiss without having to mention that we need a better visa pipeline. So unemployment in rural America is a couple of percentage points lower than the national average. And in some of these areas, there's a large participation rate. So there's already those workers that are actively participating in the workforce. And we can talk about building new packing plants or building new farms, but and moving ships through faster, but it all comes down to labor availability on farm, at the packing plant, at the tracking facility, or the truckers, and at the port. So it's certainly, that's one of the things that we certainly need to have a holistic approach.
Great. Well, thanks so much to all of you. It's been very interesting. Really delighted to be here. We do have a planned break now. So I believe we'll break until 11 a.m. and then have some more programming. Thanks again.
Thank you all for sticking with us these past 2 days. We are incredibly grateful to all of you for joining us. Before I introduce our next panel, and I want to invite on Sarah Bianchi and Robert Holliman, who I see is already on screen. I want to give a final shout out to some of the people you are watching today's event with, who you're in community with at our 2022 Washington International Trade Conference. Welcome to Jennifer Prescott with Amazon Web Services, Christopher Melly with AIG, Dave Salmonson with the American Farm Bureau Federation, and Andrew Jory with the Embassy of Australia. Welcome, Jennifer, Christopher, Dave, and Andrew, and thank you to all of you. I'm especially pleased now to welcome our closing keynote speaker, a first-time visitor to the WITA stage, but someone who's been well-known in Washington for many years, Ambassador Sarah Bianchi, America's Deputy United States Trade Representative, who previously served in the office of Vice President Biden and as Deputy Assistant to President Obama for Economic Policy. Welcome, Sarah, to the WITA stage. Ambassador Bianchi will be joined by another good friend of WITA and friend of many of you, Ambassador Robert Holliman, the former Deputy United States Trade Representative and currently President and CEO of C&M International, a frequent visitor on the WITA stage. Robert, pleasure to have you on our WITA webinar again. I get you did the conference last year. You hosted a panel on digital trade that we did with guests from Geneva and New Zealand. This year, I think you're in New Mexico, I believe, and Sarah's coming to us from Washington. So real pleasure to have both of you here. Sarah, welcome to the WITA stage.
Well, thanks for having me. It's really great to be here. I know you guys have had a great conference, and looking forward to joining you this morning.
Great. Thank you very much, Ken, and thanks to all the participants for WITA. It's a pleasure to be with you today, virtually, both in the private sector and in my time in government. I always thought this was a great forum to bring folks together. And I particularly want to thank Ambassador Bianchi for being the guest today and having a discussion before this group, a fantastic group of trade policy experts and people who care about trade and international relations and from all sectors. And so thank you, Ambassador Bianchi, for being part of this. What I'd like to do is, Ambassador and I agreed that we would have a bit of a discussion back and forth and really use this as an opportunity that we can get to know her, know a little bit about her portfolio, understand some of the priorities that she has on her plate at the U.S. Trade Representative's office. So let me, without further ado, let me kick that off and just say, Ambassador, you've now been in office for 4 months, if my count is right. How's it going?
Well, thank you, and thanks for joining here with me. I know you know this perch well, so it's going so far so good. I survived the confirmation process, so that is a feat in of itself these days. And focusing on a lot of different issues, the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework. Some of these I know we're going to talk more about, but working together with the Commerce Department there, which is the centerpiece of our engagement in economic engagement in the region. Working on China, the bilateral trade relationship there, and ensure that it's fair, and then doing a lot of work in Africa as well, in particular deepening our trade investment relationship with Kenya. So a lot going on over here. So far, so good.
Good. Well, we're thrilled you're there, and thank you for what you're doing and in a very broad portfolio. I know that one of the things that differs a little bit from one USTR to another is the portfolio and responsibilities for each of the deputies. Could you share a little bit, Ambassador, what your current portfolio is? You alluded to that a bit, but kind of help us understand kind of what's on your plate and what's in your area of responsibility.
Yeah, no, it's interesting how different USTRs divide these things up in different ways. But for our administration, I am working on covering basically Asia and Africa in terms of regions. So that's our regional offices that cover the Southeast Asia and Pacific, South and Central Asia, Japan, Korea, and APEC, and then of course China. And then Africa. And then, as you know, USTR, there's kind of a regional divide, and then there's also functional offices. And I oversee USTR's work on small business, market access, and industrial competitiveness, service and investment, and textiles. So that's kind of how it all works out. Of course, there's intersections across along the way, and I work with our other deputy, Jamie White, on a number who I know many of you know. And so there's a lot of cross-cutting issues as well. But that's how we've divided the world.
Good. It's a big world to divide. And thank you for sharing that. And I think it also really gives us a sense of kind of how you're prioritizing the work you're doing. Before we kind of jump into some of the heart of trade questions, just a little bit more about your background, if you could share. I know you've had times previously where you've been both in government, times in the private sector, before you now come back into government in your current role. Can you share any perspectives on either of those, government or private sector, of how that maybe influences how you think about some of these issues as you come back into government at this point in time?
Sure. So I've split my career, as you mentioned, between the public and private sector. In the private sector, worked on Wall Street for a number of years, both at an investment bank, most recently Evercore, as well as at a hedge fund. I also worked at Airbnb, so I got to see a lot of the issues that I know folks focus on. I worked on global policy development there, so got to see a lot of how some of these issues play around the world. And in the public sector, a number of different roles, both in administrations on Capitol Hill, but most recently I was. Before this role, I was then Vice President Biden's head of domestic and economic policy in the White House, working on all of the issues, leading all of his staff work on those issues. I would say, I bring all of that to this role. Certainly bring the perspective of the private sector. I've seen when Ambassador Tai and I were in Japan and Korea and India, I met with some of the private sector companies there, and understood a lot of what they were talking about data protectionism and some of the issues that are at play there, and also so that certainly informs some of what our companies face out in the world, and in the public sector, I think really. I really have a deep sense of what, Biden is solving for with regard to America's workers. And that obviously plays into worker-centered trade policy and really trying to keep, workers at the forefront of our thinking on everything that we do. So, you always bring all of your past selves to these kind of roles. And certainly that's the case for me.
And as you should, and that's an incredibly rich and diverse background to bring to this. You've sort of touched on worker-centered trade, so maybe I could kind of dive a little bit more into how you think about that. You certainly know the president well. I think that throughout the administration, certainly Ambassador Tai, as you've talked about today, really talk about sort of worker-centered trade. Could you discuss that a little bit more? I mean, I think there's a lot of conversations around what does that mean? What does that not mean? How do we think about it? I'd be curious sort of your thoughts and maybe kind of help the trade community as we think through these issues as well.
Yeah, I think what it means is that workers are front and center on all of the work we do on trade. And I think, I think you saw that in much of the work that we did last year. where we strengthened our global trade relationships and resolving some long-standing trade irritants, creating new tools to engage in the future. But I think in particular, you saw it by the way that we enforced brought some cases for USMCA and using the rapid response mechanism twice to protect the rights of workers in Mexico. I think you saw it in the way that we worked independently and with our allies to combat forced labor and global supply chains. The G7 trade ministers issued the first ever standalone forced labor statement that expresses, our shared desire to work together and with businesses to combat this practice. And then from everything from, ending the 17-year-long civil aircraft dispute, suspending tariffs for 5 years and protecting aviation jobs on both sides of the Atlantic. So I think it kind of infuses all of our work, and that will continue into the future as well.
Yeah. So I think the USMCA that's sort of a great example, and a great example of a new trade agreement. And certainly Ambassador Tai had a big role in that, as did Ambassador White and others. So that's a good example of kind of the best, what I guess I would describe as the most modern trade agreement that the U.S. has, that really includes very specific provisions around how to deal with labor. In the countries that you oversee, you've got a mix of countries where we have existing trade agreements, like Korea or Australia, and other countries where we don't have trade agreements, like China or India. So if we're thinking also about worker-centered trade, do you have any sense of how we might, is there much of a difference that we can think of between how we deal with worker issues with countries where we have existing agreements? Might some of those need to be updated, or other countries like India, where we really don't have a free trade agreement at this point in time?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. I think we are centering around both all of our priorities and initiatives. And we think our trade partners have a critical role to play in helping ensure that all trade policy is meaningful results. So certainly it is a more live and vibrant when you're trying to come up with something new and negotiate, like you said, USMCA being sort of a modern day trade agreement with regard to what it can do for our workers. But I think it also behooves us to go back and look at some of what we've done and see where it makes sense to revisit some of the issues. I think it's really driving all the work that we do here.
Great, thank you. Well, one of the issues that I think I've now gone a couple of questions without mentioning China or in detail. So knowing that there are a lot of folks, probably everybody who's participating in this, where China-related trade issues get a huge amount of attention. And kind of as I think about it, and I think as most of us think about it, they're really probably two kind of key ways of thinking about it. One is in the sort of bilateral trade relationship between China and the US and what that means. And then secondly, there's this broader implication of the distortive trade practices that China has that centers around a lot of attention, not just from the US, but many of our trading partners. When I was in your office, we spent a lot of time in the Obama-Biden administration working on China issues, including China trade issues. Big focus. It escalated with the imposition of tariffs during the Trump administration. I'd say the challenges since President Biden has taken office and Vice President Harris have probably even grown since that time. So in thinking specifically about the trade elements, we had a lot of fanfare around a phase one trade agreement with China during the Trump administration. But I think there's a pretty broad consensus, certainly shared by USTR, that the Chinese government did not comply fully with all the expectations of the phase one deal, certainly around the purchases, which some of us would argue purchase agreements are not really trade agreements, but that's another conversation we could have. But what are your thoughts about the current state of U.S.-China trade relations and your role?
Well, thanks for the question. And you're right, we can't get too far into this conversation without talking about China, which is good. I'm really in the thick of this conversation for the administration and with the Chinese. And you're, of course, right that China fell short on its phase one commitments. And we've been actively engaging in discussions, and I have specifically with my counterpart in Beijing on this matter. And so very attuned to this issue. You know, we're trying to create, this is a really important relationship. We're trying to create a stable relationship, but it's also a difficult one. And we're in a difficult stage in the relationship. To be super candid, the conversations are not easy. They're very difficult, but, but from my perspective, what's important is we're having conversations and they will be unflinchingly honest. It is, really clear that the Chinese haven't met their commitment in phase one. That's something we're trying to address. But I also want to emphasize it's clear that China's state-centered and non-market policies and practices, which were not addressed in the phase one agreement, are also a serious threat to American economic interests. And we have and will continue to raise these concerns with Beijing as well. And really plan to use the full range of tools we have and develop new tools as needed to defend our interests.
So to the sort of broader elements that you've discussed, I mean, there are parts of that the U.S. and you and USTR are doing independently, but there's also work I know that's underway with many of our allies around how to deal with some of these practices. Can you share any perspective on work with our allies to try to address some of these broader trade practices with China that are viewed as not focused solely on the U.S., but that have a ripple effects globally?
Well, it's a great point, and this is not something where we can do this alone. That's a very big priority for the president and for Ambassador Tai, is that we need our partners to engage in all aspects of our trade relationships and in all aspects of our diplomacy. And so we have been working with our allies and partners on strategies to address China's non-market trade practices, to work towards a level playing field and competition. I think the U.S. and the EU certainly have a shared interest in building up our common values to protect mutual competitiveness and technological leadership, and from the challenges, again, posed by the non-market economies, including China. So we've done a number of things to date, and there's more to come. But certainly, there was the technology, the TTC. Council that the president launched with Secretary Blinken and Secretary Raimondo and Ambassador Tai. That's important. We're having a new trilateral relationship with the EU and Japan. So we're working in all kinds of ways to try and bolster our relationship with allies so that we can work on these issues together.
Great. Thank you for that. And it's I think there are some potential opportunities. I think that's one of the things that the president spoke very strongly about the fact that we can't do all this alone. And I think given the nature of the challenge, it really speaks to the need to work with allies. Well, let me ask you another question about allies, and maybe this is a question then that goes to sort of the heart of your region and some of the reference you made up front to the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework. I think it's pretty clear that there's not the appetite either by the president or by Congress to revise the TPP at this point or to join the CPTPP. Certainly the administration, and you talked about this earlier at the outset, really speaking a lot and doing a lot of work on the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework. Based on some of the public statements to date, this will not be a binding trade agreement, but it's a framework for cooperation in certain areas. What else can you share? And what can you share about USTR's role in that process?
Yeah, I think this initiative is actually pretty exciting and will be pretty robust. I think I know there's a lot of questions about it. But I think, look, first of all, the fundamental goal of the framework is, of course, to strengthen our economic ties in the region, improve our connectivity. And the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework is the centerpiece of that. But it's going to include, it's co-chaired by us, Ambassador Tai and Secretary Raimondo, and it's going to include, fair and resilient trade, supply chain resilience, infrastructure and decarbonization, and tax and anti-corruption. And we're the lead agency for fair and resilient trade. And I think regarding the trade piece, we are going to be seeking binding commitments with our trading partners, whether it's in digital area, labor, or environment. In the digital, we're going to be looking at a number of issues like addressing data localization, issues like cross-border data flows. We're also, in this initiative, going to be looking at competition issues. And so I think people, when they really see the details, are going to find that this is, rather robust. It's not going to contain market access commitments, but there are going to be high standard rules to increase interoperability, competitiveness among the parties to the arrangement. So I think we just are a little bit in the early innings here, and that as people learn more, they'll find that there's a fair amount of meat to the approach we're thinking about.
So to drill down into this a little bit, and I realize that there may be limits on how much you can say because it's not been unveiled fully. I think there's been discussions about whether there might be modules as part of this agreement. When all countries join all parts, are there modules? You may still be working on that. Anything you can share about sort of that thinking in the process?
Happy to talk a little bit more about it. You're right, there's going to be modules, although I have to say that my staff teases me because I find that word to sound a little bit more like something that you would talk about at the Container Store than in a trade deal. But I understand there are going to be modules. I think I mentioned some of them. Fair and resilient trade is certainly one. That's the one we'll be chairing. Supply chain resilience is one. Infrastructure and decarbonization is one, and tax and anti-corruption. All of those will be quote unquote modules. And look, I think they will move at different speeds. There'll be different countries for the trade piece. The way we think about it is that if you're going to be in the trade module per se, you have to be in the whole thing. You can't pick and choose within it. And we're seeking to have a really high standard and inclusive commitments there. Looking at specific provisions on labor, environment, climate, competition, digital, but we're also looking at how we can make rules-based commitments. The United States normally pursues a bit more inclusive. So can we make our customs systems and our customs officials more accessible to groups underrepresented in international trade? Can we find mechanisms that make data centers greener? But also, how do we make overall address competition issues, address data localization, address cross-border flows? So I think within the trade module itself, it will be very high ambition. It may be that not all countries who are joining the overall agreement or joining pieces of this will choose to join the trade one. That's okay. We want to keep it really, again, high ambition, rules-based, and, text-based negotiations, that are binding. So that's really the goal.
Great, thank you. I know that there's a lot of interest also in Congress about this, and
sure.
Certainly in where there used to be Trade Promotion Authority, Congress had a keen interest in every aspect of a negotiation. This is not a free trade agreement per se. There's no trade promotion authority, but you've also got a lot of friends and folks in Congress who want to be involved in this. Can you share some thoughts about the role of Congress in part of this process?
Well, the role of Congress is absolutely critical here in terms of close consultation. Ambassador Tai comes from the Hill, and one thing we are, and as does Ambassador White and many people in this building. And so one of the things we are always keeping in mind is how to keep Congress well consulted early and often, and we plan to do that. We don't plan to have market access commitments under the IPEF, so it's a bit more of an administrative arrangement there that includes high standard outcomes and meaningful commitments, but it will be developed with extensive consultation among our trading partners, with our stakeholders. And I can assure you, including close consultation with the Congress.
Is there anything you can share about thoughts around any enforcement mechanism around trade? Certainly a traditional trade agreement would have an enforcement mechanism. Anything that you can share at this still early stage about how you may be thinking about potential enforcement mechanisms for this?
I think we're still in the early stages there, to be honest. So I'll probably leave it at that.
Okay. We'll have you back when
Fair
this
enough.
is all unveiled and to
Fair
dive
enough.
into more of those. A lot of interest in this. Well,
Got
one
it.
of the other things that I know you did early in your tenure was that you and Ambassador Tai went to India for the reinstituted Trade Policy Forum. Was personally delighted that you all reinstituted that, and certainly, I think the importance of the engagement between the U.S. and India on trade issues is can't be understated, overstated. And so there was a recent announcement from Department of Agriculture around pork products. Any thoughts overall, maybe around the U.S.-India trade relationship, or signs of progress? Thoughts about next steps in your work?
Yeah, well, as you mentioned, Ambassador Tai and I were in India, and reinvigorating the Trade Policy Forum there was a big priority. And we were actually quite pleased with how the discussions went in Delhi. While a long list of trade concerns remain, it was encouraging that we were able to resolve, a set of longstanding priorities such as pork, like you mentioned. And just as importantly, Ambassador Tai and Minister Goyal agreed to relaunch the TPF working groups and engage on a number of cross-cutting emerging trade issues as well. And so what that means is our teams will be engaging and prioritizing resolution of market access issues, but also means like deepening our dialogue in other areas, including digital trade issues, good regulatory practices, technical barriers. So as the TPF working groups begin to reengage, we're hopeful that we're moving to a really productive period here.
Do you envision that there may be elements at some point of the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework that could?
Yes.
India?
I think in terms of India's participation in IPEF, we're balancing the desire to be inclusive with the need for high ambition and expeditious outcomes. But we recognize the importance of being open to a range of economies in the region. So we'll see. India may or may not be willing to engage on a number of the IPEF priorities, but they're certainly an important player in the region. And we also expect to use the Trade Policy Forum to engage in raise many of the issues directly with India. So regardless of what form, we're going to be having an active and in-depth dialogue.
Good. Well, it's a challenge working with India on many trade issues historically, and you will see that as many of your colleagues over the years have seen, but such an important relationship for the U.S. to be working on.
Absolutely.
So many areas, including, I think, in digital, where there should be more commonalities, and hopefully we'll be able to
Absolutely. No, as I mentioned, I met with some of our companies in India, and they have right, there's some real opportunity for progress for sure.
Good, good. Well, let me ask you one of the other areas you mentioned in your sort of portfolio of issues, which I'm very intrigued by, and I'd love to hear more about it, is industrial competitiveness. I mean, that's probably at the forefront of so much of what is on the minds of policymakers, on people here in the discussion. We don't as often get to hear a USTR, Deputy USTR sort of talk about her role on those issues. Maybe share some more about what you're doing, how you're thinking about that, how that fits into the interagency, super important issue for the country.
Yeah, no, you're right, it is. And industrial competitiveness generally is a really important priority for the Biden-Harris administration. Right now, a lot of that is focused on supply chains and supply chain. The president has a sort of a whole of government effort on a range of issues there that have left the U.S. businesses and economy vulnerable to disruptions like we saw in the COVID pandemic. So the programs and investments that have been proposed, in addition to steps the administration has taken, will enhance competitiveness by diversifying the supply chains and reducing dependence on single sources, training a 21st century workforce, et cetera. And we're constantly looking for, how we can use trade policy to complement those efforts. We're also actively engaged with our trading partners to reduce barriers to U.S. exports, and a full agenda with bilateral discussions on some of our TIFA agreements, plans for new initiatives such as the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, and issues in like trade facilitation, custom procedures, good regulatory practices, is all of those things. And then finally, we are also focused on trade enforcement agenda to counter some of the unfair trade practices that are harming United States producers, which include not only challenges from the China industrial policies, but also ensuring that the World Trade Organization is adequately equipped to address non-market practices that undermine global trade and affect, industrial competitiveness. So we have a full and robust agenda there, and that's part of the overall administration strategy.
Do you have any? I know Congress is also playing a role on many of these
Sure.
issues, not specific to trade necessarily, but do you want to offer any thoughts about what Congress is considering about the U.S. Innovation and Competition Act on the Hill, or administration thoughts about that?
Yeah, no, we're working closely with Congress on that legislation to achieve goals. We're in the throes of the different pieces of the legislation and what's in the House and the Senate and all of those things. But I think on balance, the main point is that we're committed to, revitalizing manufacturing, ensuring resilient supply chains, competitiveness of the economy. All of these things are underlying goals that we share with the Congress, and really look forward to working together on those issues.
You also mentioned, Ambassador, at the outset, in your portfolio, you have Africa, and I think you mentioned Kenya, and I know there had been some discussions about a possible free trade agreement with Kenya. A lot of ground to cover around Africa, and a limited amount of time today, but maybe share some thoughts about how you're looking at trade with countries in that continent, how you may be thinking about Kenya, others eager to hear more.
Great. Well, we are seeking, you're right, to grow our trade investment with partners on the African continent, in a way that delivers equitable, inclusive prosperity to all countries and their workers. Ambassador Tai hosted the AGOA virtual ministerial in October to exchange perspectives with her counterparts on that vision, and met in person in December with the Secretary General of Africa Continental Free Trade Area to discuss how we can support their regional integration. We have been doing a lot of robust engagement with Kenya. We're exploring ways to deepen our trade and investment relationship there with the goal of promoting investment and equitable development and sustainable trade. So at the same time, we want to be supportive of Kenya and its Africa partners' regional economic integration objectives in the African Continental Free Trade Area. So you'll have more to say on Kenya in the coming weeks, but we do want to keep a really deep engagement going. We've met a number of times with the Kenyans, and that's something I think we'll have some news to share in the coming weeks.
Great, thank you. We will be eager to invite you back to pursue.
I know we have a lot more to talk about.
we do. Well, listen, before I invite Ken Levinson to come back in, and we've got some questions that I know that are coming in from the participants. Is there anything I've missed? Anything in this sort of broad work around trade or work you're doing that you'd like to discuss a little bit before we open it up for questions from the group?
No, you've done quite a comprehensive twirl through a lot of issues very fast. So thank you for that. But no, mostly I just wanted to say, that WIDA does such a good job of really bringing together so many of our stakeholders, and this really is a much broader effort than anything we can do at USTR. It really is about so many stakeholders in Washington and around the country and around the world, that make this thing go. And so just grateful to you all for having me.
Great. Thank you, Ambassador. Ken, welcome back to the conversation.
Appreciate the kind introduction, Sarah. Thank you very much. We're trying to stay abreast of everything that you are working on and your colleagues. Try to get ahead of a few things that we've been trying to do on trade and the environment, and our series on trade and the environment and worker-centered trade as well. So trying to help bring together as many ideas as we can from different parts of the U.S. policy spectrum, the economy, from our global trading partners, and our people who watch our events around the United States and around the world. So we have several questions that have come in. I'm going to jump around a little bit because they hit on a bunch of the different topics that we've hit today. Sometimes I try to bunch them together, but one I'm going to read off. Dan Pearson, who is a former chair of the International Trade Commission and has written a lot about tariffs. He has a view that they have been probably hurting the U.S. as much as they've been harming China, or maybe more so in some cases. What are some of the reasons, that we have for keeping those tariffs still in place today? And is that something that's holding back the U.S. economy currently?
Well, I think the way that you have to think about the China relationship is as a holistic economic relationship. And the way that we've thought about it is to really start with looking at the phase one agreement across the board, and particularly around the purchase commitments. Where, as we discussed, China isn't kind of keeping its commitments. We did, as part of that announcement, agree to open an exclusions a process that put in place a process to have some tariff reductions where it's appropriate, and those are kinds of things that we've looked at and could look at in the future. But I think right now the U.S. economy has a lot going for it, and it's our job to really make sure that we take this holistic approach with China and make sure that we're addressing, all of the different concerns, including some of the non-market economic concerns. So that's kind of the path we'll continue to go down.
And so, you've talked about some of the competitiveness issues, USICA, and your close work with the Congress on that, and all the very many people on your team who've come from the Hill and have so many of those relationships with the Hill. And you're spending a lot of time on China, and what are some of the other levers? Do we have other levers in play that we can be utilizing to get them to meet some of the commitments they've made and maybe haven't been able, as Robert called them, purchase agreements? But are there other levers that we can be deploying that we haven't even started using yet, or turning up the heat? Or is there any effort to turn up the heat and try to get them to meet some of those commitments?
Well, it's not our goal to escalate here, but certainly we're looking at all of the tools that we have in our toolbox to make sure they're held accountable. The phase one agreement that the prior administration negotiated, has limits in that regard. But we're going to look at all the tools that we have, and both on the phase one commitments, and then also, as I mentioned, some of the other concerns that we have about the non-market economic practices that are really these are unfair economic practices that are hurting our businesses. So we're going to look at everything available to us.
And while not strictly, it has nothing to do with the phase one agreement, but maybe, sticking with the China issue a little bit. Can you talk a little bit about the nexus of human rights and trade and the views of USTR in this administration? Obviously, the issues in Xinjiang and with Uyghur, the Uyghur
Sure.
issues are ones that have been front and center, but maybe just talk a little bit more about the values that you all have and your thoughts about that.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of human rights concerns that have been raised by this administration that have been put forward front and center. And, that's part of the overall China relationship. Much of that, we work with and is managed by, our counterparts at the National Security Council, the State Department, other parts of the administration. But it's a really important priority. And, it certainly plays into the work that we're doing. And I think the president has made very clear how important this is to him. And so anyways, that's, I guess, what I would say about that. But that's something we work as a whole of government across many different, parts of the government to address.
And thank you for saying that whole government. I was going to, that was related to some of our questions. We had a panel yesterday on China, where we brought in people to talk about the larger strategic relationship with China. It's obviously so much more than just a trading relationship. And there's so many other issues. And that's something that at WIDA we try to keep front and center, is to understand the full context of the US-China relationship. Related to that, we have actually 3 questions that have come in about the Indo-Pacific framework. So there's obviously a lot of interest. Starting with, one of the basics you mentioned about working with stakeholders and consulting with the Hill. One question comes in is, what are our partnership points for U.S. business and companies that they can be helpful and having their voice heard and also helping advance this agenda?
Well, that's a great question because we certainly need the help, and we are always an open door. We have a lot of places, ways to talk to us at USTR, and delighted to have those conversations. I think also we can use some help once we get going here with our trading partners. And I think there's a lot of enthusiasm about having the United States really back engaged heavily in the region, but knowing that the important from the business community and others really will help us secure some of these agreements. And, we're not offering all the traditional market access tools that we have in the past. And so, but I think there's a lot of advantage, whether it's in the digital space or whether it's in competitiveness. There's a lot of advantage for American industry to play a big role here. And we look forward to working with everybody on it.
So that's great. I'm sure that a lot of folks are happy to hear about that. Is there, one of the questions that came in too is, as you're pursuing these engagements, are there any related efforts on climate change that'll be part of this initiative, related to decarbonization and other strategies that might be part of the Indo-Pacific framework? Again, thinking of the whole of government, but also the whole trade agenda, and clearly trade and the environment is something that has escalated in importance for the administration.
Yeah, I mean, infrastructure and decarbonization is a whole module, if you will, on it that will be run by Commerce. So I'll leave it to them to share more details. But and then within the trade module, there is a whole section on environment and climate, and that has a lot of different components. So we plan to make this a very big part of the overall effort.
Great. And another question that's come in has to do with How are we engaging with developing economies in the region? What flexibilities might be included in this to have them engaged in the Indo-Pacific framework?
Well, we are going to reach out to some developing economies, and I think there's definitely an important role that they can play. That doesn't mean that they may not want to be engaged in every part of it, and we're going to keep some of it high ambition. But certainly we'll be having a dialogue with a range of our trading partners and of all types, and so that's definitely something that we plan to be engaging with.
Well, thank you, Sarah. Really appreciate that. I'm doing a final call to our audience. If you have questions, you need to put them in. We've gone through all the ones that have been submitted. I'm not going to keep everybody extra time if there aren't more audience questions coming in. We are really grateful to you, Sarah. Robert, I know you're still online. There you are. Do you have any follow-up questions for Sarah before we wrap up our time here at the conference?
Yeah, I do. This is an Indo-Pacific economic framework, to pick this back up. When do you think that more details around that or announcements may be made?
We're definitely in the weeks, not months.
Okay. All right. Good.
Praise framework. We're working really hard. It's a lot of coordination. It's a lot of work, but we're really excited about it. And so I think you'll begin to hear more from us in the coming weeks.
That's great. There'll be a lot of interest in it.
And, I have no doubt, and we're excited about it and excited to share more as soon as we can.
By the way, take this as an open invitation for Ambassador Tai to come to WIDA. We will happy to host her for any announcements she wants to make about.
There you go.
I will
definitely let her know. I know she would love. I know she would love to come, and I know she would love to join you guys at some point.
She's been on our stage a few times with our congressional trade agenda, which I will mention momentarily. Any other thoughts or questions, Robert, before we wrap up today?
I just want to thank the ambassador, and thank you, Sarah, for being part of this conversation.
Of course.
I look forward to many of these in the future. You're always welcome at WIDA, and thanks for doing what you're doing.
Thank you. Thanks for having me, and thanks for all the great, thoughtful questions that you guys all asked.
Really grateful to you, Sarah. Folks who've asked questions throughout the day in the conference, we are forwarding all those to our panelists so they will be able to see the questions that were asked and who's asked them for any potential follow-up. With that, we are going to wrap up everything. Sarah, Ambassador Bianchi, Ambassador Holliman, thank you so much for joining us. Really appreciate your taking the time to be with us. For all our participants at the conference, really grateful to have had you there. So you guys can sign off. We're going to do some last minute stuff. We want to fill in our panels, our attendees on some big announcements. Most importantly, everybody, we want to tell you that we have scheduled our congressional trade agenda. You are the first to hear about it publicly. This is the big event we do every year. In fact, Catherine Tai, Ambassador Tai, has been a guest for the last several years at this conference. And Angela Ellard, who you saw yesterday, was an original member of this panel who did this for the last 22 years. She is not going to be with us, of course, this year, and neither will Ambassador Tai, but we do have all the new trade councils, Sally Lang, Mayor Patel, Josh Sneed, and Alexander Whitaker joining us on March 11th. This will be, again, a Zoom session, and it will only be available in person at the time of the event. This is not recorded. This is not going to be on YouTube. This is only live in person on Zoom. So you have to register to attend. And the link has been posted in the chat for everybody. We hope you will join us for that. We have several other events that are in the works for the coming months, including the celebration of and looking back at the 10 years, the U.S.-Colombia Free Trade Agreement, that we are hopeful that will be an in-person event. So we have many things in the works that'll be coming up. Please keep an eye on your emails. I know you hear a lot from us, but you'll be hearing from us about these upcoming events in the next few days. I want to thank again our sponsors for the conference. We are incredibly grateful to you, to Amazon, to the Producers Council to Trade Data Monitor to UPS, the Business Roundtable, General Motors, American Apparel and Footwear Association, Amway, the National Retail Federation, and Trade Center Management Associates and the International Trade Center at the Ronald Reagan Building, who support all of our in-person activities at the Reagan Building, and where we hope to have more live in-person events in the months to come. So thank you all for joining us this year. We hope you enjoyed the conference. We look forward to hosting you all again soon. Have a great, I guess if it's not too late to say Happy New Year, I hope everyone has a great year in 2022. We look forward to seeing you again in person. Thank you.